Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the regular Thursday, July 20th meeting of the General Plan Advisory Committee. Let the record reflect that we have a quorum of members present, and the meeting is called to order. And we will begin our meeting as usual with a moment of silence, please. Thank you very much. And if you will stand and join us in the Pledge of Allegiance. Well, you all know what it looks like. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. That brings us to the point in our agenda which is set aside for announcements from members of the GPAC. Are there any announcements this afternoon?
Right.
Glenn.
I'd just like to announce that the Open Space Alliance is going to be sponsoring a block party on September 16th to kick off our attempt to put Cerrito Peak into permanent conservancy. And you will be invited. Details to follow.
And that date again was?
September 16th in the afternoon.
September 16th. Very good. Any other announcements this afternoon? Okay, seeing none. We actually have a presentation this afternoon on the an update on what's going on with the Chevron properties north of town, and this is going to be presented by a representative from the Trust for Public Lands. I'll turn that over to Scott if you have more information.
Yeah, we have Becky Bremser from the Trust for Public Lands. She's going to provide an update related to the negotiations and the status of the Chevron properties, as you indicated, at the north end of town. Becky, if you want to come on up and let us know what's the latest, that'd be great.
Sure. Hello, I am Becky Bremser with the Trust for Public Land. And I am going to just take a little bit of time to give a brief presentation, and I'm happy to answer questions if that's appropriate too. So I put together a tiny little PowerPoint, so let's get that started. So I thought I would just kind of introduce some of you. I know most of you probably know who the Trust for Public Land is, but I'll take a second to tell you about my organization that I work for. I'll give you a little snapshot on where we are with conversations we've had with Chevron on the property north of town, and then kind of step you through some of the priorities that we've identified and just take a general temperature on that as well. So that is what I'm going to cover. I work for the Trust for Public Land, which is a national nonprofit land conservation organization. We've been around for over 40 years. Our mission is to create parks and protect land for people to ensure healthy and livable communities for generations to come. We do this mission in a variety of different ways. Probably one of the ways that you know us best is by purchasing private property to put it into public ownership. So that's the case that one of the services that we're presenting at the Chevron property. We've done a bunch of projects actually in your backyard, and this map is horrible. But the dark green indicates properties that we've actually worked on in the Morro Bay area, and kind of some of the highlights are listed there. But we've been working here for almost 20 years, which is pretty exciting, and we're hoping that the Chevron property might be a next one that we can add to this map. So just to bring you up to speed a little bit on what we've been up to, I guess it's about a year ago, we started having conversations with Chevron, and I understand that over many years, this property has kind of come and gone in fits and starts as far as from a conservation standpoint. So we started again last summer, sitting down and having conversations, and really it was the Trust for Public Land as a national land conservation organization, and then 2 local nonprofits as well, the Cayucas Land Conservancy and the Land Conservancy of San Luis Obispo County. The 3 of us together have been like sitting down and starting to have conversations with Chevron. So some of the upper management at Chevron switched about 1.5 years ago. So the person who is handling it now is interested in starting up those conversations again. So of course it's awful daunting to look at this humongous property that's owned by Chevron. Daunting in the fact that if we were going to acquire it for conservation, a type of price tag for something that's almost 3,000 acres, or who the heck would own and manage the property. These questions are really, really daunting. So slowly we started to have conversations with Chevron, knowing that they're looking to dispose of the property, put together a plan on what they want to do, how to get rid of the property. They're interested in selling. It's not a secret. And we're interested in certain priorities for this area as well. So that conversation has developed over time. So in sitting down with the 3 organizations as well as some other stakeholders in the area, in the county, in the city, the surrounding communities, we started really looking at what makes this area special. What are the things that are really the priorities? And you can see on the screen, we started just throwing things at the wall, seeing what would stick, really trying to understand what we thought the priorities were so that we could put together a plan moving forward, a conservation plan moving forward. And you can kind of see that the top 4 priorities that I feel like bubbled up from the conversations that we've had over the last 9 months, I would say, is we understand that it's very important to keep the off-leash dog beach a priority. That's loved by the community and used regularly. Keeping an open space buffer between the 2 communities of the city and Cayucas. Preserving the scenic view shed, so when you drive, you still have that sense of open space, that there's a division between the 2 places. And then, of course, completing that segment, that missing segment of the coastal trail. And then, of course, there are a lot of other things that make that place special. But we kind of listed those as secondary considerations. And on the list, we have protect and restore habitat and ecosystem function, archaeological sites, additional trail connections up into the hills, protect and enhance working landscapes, so that's the farming and ranching. Provide a visitor serving amenity, which actually, in my opinion, maybe should be moved up to the priority list. And then manage the land for fire protection. So these are things that if it were publicly owned, we could ensure and protect. So using these, we started looking at the whole property. Do we actually need to acquire all of it in order to achieve these priorities? Because again, going back to the big nut, the big, scary, daunting a little less than 3,000 acres, we kind of feel like maybe the answer is no. We can actually probably acquire a portion of the property, which I'm going to show you a map next. This is the Chevron property, and I'll walk you through it a little bit. So everybody's comfortable and familiar with where we are. And these colors don't actually indicate like any priority levels or anything. It just sort of starts blocking up the property, or breaking up the property, I would say, to achieve these different priorities. So the blue area that's highlighted, I would say, is a potential for visitor amenities, achieves that priority. It keeps the communities separated. It protects the view shed. So that's what the blue really protects. The purple, which we also considered kind of one of our priorities, it turns out is also within the view shed. So if you're on Highway 1, that is within the view shed. And we ground truth that with site visits, and also we have a 3D mapping GIS program that allows us to double check and make sure that we're accurate when we are putting these things together. And then the green area is kind of for that additional connection connections and that sort of thing. Now you'll see what's left in gray are the 6 lots owned by Chevron that are behind Panorama and other ranch land kind of up Toro Creek area back in there. So
excuse me a second.
Yes.
Where's the green?
The green
It's yellow.
or yellow.
Oh, okay.
Depends what which colorblind person. It's green to me. It might be yellow to you. Are you following? Okay. So one of the other big nuts that we have to crack too, which I probably didn't mention, is also getting a deal done with Chevron. Getting something that is, I can propose all of this all day long, but if we don't have a seller that's willing to go along with this as well, we're never going to get there. So in the conversations that we've had with Chevron for the last nine plus months, is that, and they understand that we probably don't have the capacity to acquire it all. We're looking at the sections in gray that they would retain those and potentially sell them on their own. Still trying to work all that out and deciding all of that. But this we can kind of go back and forth if you want between this map and the priority list. But this is where we're at right now. And again, this is a snapshot in time. So we don't have an agreement with Chevron. We're clearly interested. The conversations are continuing, but that's where we are today. So I would just suggest, as you guys move forward with land use decisions and the general plan updates, that perhaps keeping some of this into consideration and thinking about it as well so that we can work together on it, if that's possible. So I think that's my last slide. Yeah. If I'm happy to flip back on anything, I'm happy to answer questions if that's appropriate, or give more information if needed.
I just wanted to make a comment, if you could flip
Sure.
back one, because I saw some reactions in the audience there when you were mentioning that the colored lots would be the ones you'd consider purchasing and the gray lots were sort of more of Chevron's purview to sell. Part of the discussions earlier had been that those lots along Panorama would be very low density development, extremely, maybe 1 unit per lot, or, there may have been something adjustable there, but that selling those would give Chevron enough sort of in their own purse to feel comfortable about selling the rest of that to the Conservancy so that it could be maintained as an open space, but at a lower price. Is that kind of a nutshell?
Well, I mean, that was some of the conversations that were had. I mean, more recently at the last city council meeting, I'll call it, because we're not at this point yet, I'll call it the GPAC's recommendation, if you'll recall, as it relates to these lots, was to include those ones that are grayed out adjacent to Panorama, potentially including those in a future SOI. As it went through Planning Commission, it expanded to include that outer ring of lots that are shown in the purple and blue, not the one between, not the large lot to the upper hand side of that, but the entry area to the Chevron property, and then the lot 15 at the corner, and then the purple lots. Planning Commission's recommendation was to include those in a potential future SOI, and the council agreed with that at our last city council meeting. So that's where we're at as far as the directions have been provided by the city council with regard to those lots, and everything else would be included in the planning area, but those lots in that area would be under consideration for future sphere of influence consideration.
Susie.
Do you? I guess I'm understanding what you have here, but are there specific asks that you have for things that we're going to be looking at? I'm having a little trouble. I understand your sort of general presentation and what you're doing, but are there specific connections you draw between that and what we're going to be doing here, or are there things that you want us to be to do or to decide in a certain way that would help you in this?
That's a good question, and I think I understand what you're asking, so I'll try to answer it, and if I'm not answering it correctly, just let me know. I think that we're paying close attention to what lots you're planning on including in the sphere of influence, because when we move forward, it really, what you can do on a property also affects price. So one of the things that we're paying close attention to is which lots you're going to include potentially into the sphere of influence. So that's, and we're letting this process take place because I think it's critically important that go through its correct process. So I think that's one thing that we're paying close attention to. I think also listening to the conversations that you guys are having about the sections in the blue or the shore plant, the entrance to Chevron, just because, again, the Trust for Public Lands mission is to conserve land for people, to give people access to the outdoors. So depending on what the city's interest is for that may or may not be in line with what we're thinking. So, for example, we could call it a visitor amenity, but that could take a lot of different shapes, right? We've heard hotel, I've heard campground. Those are very different things. So I think also we're listening and paying attention to the conversations that are having for the shore plant too. Does that answer?
Not exactly.
Okay.
But let me ask Scott something then. What you just said was, I think you said that the pink area, and we're talking pink, purple, and gray, and I'm not sure we're all talking about the same colors here. But when you said that the Planning Commission and the City Council had added some to the sphere of influence, where you is that the sort of the pinkish that part? Okay. And then you said something about gray, and I didn't know what you were talking about. Okay. And when
it's these, it's these. And it's not.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So which ones are the panorama lots then?
That's the grayed out ones right here.
Oh, those are the okay, because that looks the same color as the stuff on top, and I wasn't sure what we were talking about. Okay. So are you okay then with having all of that in the sphere of influence? Does that help you, or hurt you, or what? How does that relate to what you were saying?
So I think I'm not exactly sure how to answer that because I don't have a strong opinion one way or the other. I think that the panorama lots, the 6 that are in gray, including those into the sphere of influence, is helpful to what we're working on. Anything outside of that, maybe not. But again, we're going to let this process take place.
Okay, so when you're saying specifically is the part in pink and the part in blue, purple, whatever that is up there, you're not necessarily you're not necessarily in agreement that should be in the sphere of influence.
That's correct.
Okay, all right, but you're saying that the city council's already agreed that at least the pink part or both parts will come in that way.
So what I'm saying is that's the most recent direction that we have, and that doesn't include any of the conversations and negotiations
totally separate
they've been having, and so that could change as a result of those negotiations. The city council is very interested in the preservation of that land out there and whatever makes the most sense, for that to take place. So that's where we're at right now. The negotiations are going to take probably a very long time.
That's right.
And so I think I want to speak for Becky, but I'm guessing what she's saying is just keeping an eye towards this, and that things might change, and that she might be coming back for other asks later on, potentially. That's sort of, I think, what the concept here is that as things materialize and become more clear from a negotiation standpoint, then we might be having more conversations, and this map might change, or our map might change.
Yeah, I think that's a fair. I think that both of these are independent, and I wish I had a better answer. It's kind of a chicken and an egg. It's also wishing one thing would move faster than the other. But it is a snapshot in time, and I think this is where we are right now. And I think that was one of the reasons I wanted to come and just continue the dialogue, I suppose, as everything moves forward, both from our end and from your side.
Okay, I'm not sure that really gives us a lot of guidance, but let me ask one more question. The area in pink, is that on the far side of the ridge, or is that on the side that's visible?
It kind of goes up, drops back down, then goes back up again. When it goes back up again, that's the pink, purple, whatever you want to call that.
Okay, so that area is visible from, say, the ridge,
city and
the
ridge line on that is visible. So you have 2 ridges on the 2 properties.
Right.
You have a ridge that runs in this one, and then you have a ridge towards the top of these lots. And issue being, right, if they were to develop those lots with homes, you could have houses at the top of them, which is one of the reasons the Planning Commission's recommendation moving forward to City Council was, we don't want that. We want to have a say at where those are located, so they're not in the backdrop of the city if that's what happens. I think City Council would be just as happy if they were preserved in some other manner and we didn't have to do that. We didn't have to have any development. They'd be probably ecstatic about that. So again, I think it's a little bit of a moving target, and it has, as it plays out, we'll have more information. And again, on down the road, we may be having this conversation a few more times about what the city may be willing to accept or change, or whether we're interested in changing our ideas about where the SOI should go or not.
Okay.
Based on the preservation plays that are out there.
I'm not sure that gives us a lot of guidance, but as we go, if you could let us know if we're hitting on issues that would affect this, I think as we go, I think that would be helpful.
Certainly.
So, Scott, could I ask a question? Those are currently zoned, those lots above Panorama are currently zoned agricultural, right?
They're agricultural.
And they're outside of the city limits.
They're in the county.
So with whatever we do in our general plan, we're not changing the zoning for
Our
that.
intent is to keep the land use the same out there. For whether it's in the SOI would be to identify that as agricultural use. The area is inside the coastal zone, so the coastal zone boundary is actually shown on there very lightly in red. The areas inside of that allow for one house, and the areas outside of it allow for two, basically. So,
Okay.
and under the county's requirements, I don't know that we'd be looking to increase density out there if there wasn't some other reason to do so. Or significant reason to do so.
I have a quick question for Scott. So we've had 3 or 4 presentations by Chevron over the last numbers of months. Not sure it's really good use of time for this committee, frankly. We have a lot of more important things to deal with. I'm not sure, you mentioned the GPAC recommended something. We've seen these presentations. I don't remember a formal recommendation from this committee to anybody about this at all.
Well, I mean,
Did I
the
miss something?
GPAC isn't really making recommendations. It was the majority input that came out of the GPAC was to include that first line of lots. Yeah,
Oh, so
and
that's just from-
I
that's
think
just
this is a
from
very
comments
valuable
of committee
conversation given the
members.
significant interest on the part of the council for this. So,
Yeah, well-
we will probably continue to have these as we move forward.
Well, I'm not sure it's a good use of our time if council's going to make the decisions. So.
Okay.
Good.
Thank you.
Could I make another comment?
Yeah.
Or ask another question?
I think so.
I think this has been a great use of our time, and I think it's a really important issue to talk about. Acquisition is one thing, obviously, and maintenance and operations are another thing. So obviously you wouldn't be talking necessarily to Chevron about, maintenance and operations, because if they're going to offload, they're going to offload it. And,
That's right.
But is that, obviously that's part of the conversation, right? And is that's a joint, the operations maintenance, conversation is joint between all 3 conservation entities? Obviously you guys have a lot of experience in this.
Sure.
The others as well.
Yeah, so I think what you're asking is ultimately who will be the owner, manager, operator of the property, and that is still part of the larger conversation as well. So whether it's the nonprofits, whether it's the county, whether there's some partnership with the city in some way, is all still to be determined.
Okay, so that's still part of the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely.
yeah.
But it won't be Chevron.
Right,
Okay.
clearly it won't be Chevron.
Yeah.
So that's why, that's, to me, that's the big sort of question, right? And then, but can you speak to, there's a lot of conversation, obviously. It is a huge issue. It is a huge land use issue for this city. What happens adjacent to us, and, whether it's in the sphere or not in the sphere, those are really big land use conversations. It should be part of what we're talking about. It's part of a general plan update. And I've heard a lot of sentiment about, just leave it alone, like why should we take this on? So I think you're really well placed to speak to the experience that you've had, right? That TPL has had with what have been some of the effects of taking, of spaces like this in communities, because my knowledge says the benefits are usually pretty substantial.
Yeah, so are you asking either acquiring or not acquiring? Is that the difference? Or some of the benefits of acquiring?
Benefits of acquiring.
Yeah, it's what I do, so
Right.
I see a lot of value behind it.
You're well placed to speak about
Yeah,
the
but I think,
benefits,
some of the things that I would talk to is it, it keeps the integrity of the community and sort of the essence of the place as is, where you have actual control. Once it's acquired and put into open space, you know that is forever and what it's going to be. And I really think that this property is totally geared to have an amazing visitor amenity experience that could be created. And I just think that this is a fantastic place to do it if it's done smartly with all of these players that we've talked about, from the city to the county to these nonprofits. I just think it's positioned well to do that, versus either Chevron selling it and potentially trying to develop it, which we all know there would be huge challenges with that. But that would be, their intention is to unload this property. So I think we are at a unique moment in time. So I hope that answers.
Yeah. And I would just say I agree with you. To me, the balancing habitat, ecosystem, working landscapes, and visitor access and amenity, to me, those things are all priorities.
Yeah, and they're all right
just
here.
To observe that, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Can we get your map?
Yeah, I left it on the computer, and I will email one to Scott so he can have it too.
Email it to me. I'll distribute it to them.
Sounds good.
CPAC.
Yeah.
Becky?
Sure.
The area adjacent to and just to the east of the current administration buildings,
Yes.
do you know the area I'm talking about?
Yes.
A little valley kind of?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Seems to be an area which would be very developable as visitor amenities in different forms. The city keeps talking about a conference center. That's one of the few areas where there's enough land area to do something like that. My question is, from your point of view, and Chevron has been pretty straightforward in terms of saying, look, we just want X number of dollars for this land and we're out of here, kind of thing. So my question is, would pushing forward with that concept, the concept of visitor serving amenities, be helpful in generating part of the dollars that Chevron wants to make the whole process go forward?
Yes, I think I understand, and I don't have a straightforward answer for you. I think that their idea, although I haven't been to the presentations, is hotel, conference center, that sort of thing, which isn't necessarily what I'm envisioning or what the Trust for Public Land is thinking.
Well, yeah, I don't think...
Is that not accurate?
I don't know that Chevron has that much of a specific idea.
Yeah, people are agreeing with you.
To be straightforward, what they've said is, look, we want $30 million for the property. We don't care. You can do whatever you want. After that, what I'm asking, I guess, is, would the potential for being able to do something like that, either by selling the property, part of the property, or a long-term land lease, would that be economically helpful in making that happen?
I'm going to say something that takes it a little bit different, which might answer the question kind of from a different direction. So we are going to be working to assemble a whole lot of acquisition money to do blue, pink, yellow, green, whatever. And it's going to be through a lot of different public grants, and we're going to lobby for money, and we don't do earmarks anymore, but we're going to be assembling a whole lot of public money to do this. And when we bring our public agencies down here, we submit those grants, we're going to be giving them maps, and we're going to be showing them what the plan is for the property, what the hopes and dreams are for the property. And I would say that where you're talking is the blue. Let me see if I can... This area, right?
Further toward.
Maybe a little further west.
A little further west, somewhere in here. So one of the things, if you look at what we have here, is that would be a big block between it doesn't create a connection between the whole property. When you're sitting in Sacramento and you're looking at that, you want to see connections. So we want to have we want to be able to show that we're not putting a convention center right here. That isn't something that would be favorably funded. So that might present a challenge in us assembling a whole bunch of money to do this. But if we showed there are restrooms and there's a campground and that sort of thing, that goes in line with a lot of the funding agencies that we would be going after.
Okay.
Is that
that's very helpful.
Fair answer?
That's very helpful. That's very. And how are you coordinating with Morro Bay Open Space Alliance on?
Yeah,
this?
We're talking to them. We're talking a bit with the city. We're talking with the county, and then of course Cayuga's Land Conservancy, and the other conservancy, yeah, a lot of different, the counties involved, if I didn't mention them. Yeah, so having conversations and just keeping people informed. So, yeah.
Great.
Okay, we're going to need everybody's help when it comes down to it. Yeah.
So this all leads me to just one final thing, I hope, but it's a really complicated process and a very complicated deal. It isn't done yet, and it might not get done. Is that true?
Yeah, I would say that we're doing everything we can to further these conversations,
Right.
but there are a lot of steps and it's going to take a long time.
And is it the case that at some point in this process, you may be coming back to the city and saying, here's a role you need to play?
Yeah, absolutely. I think.
And it would be a policy role that will involve a council decision, probably. Is that correct?
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure what you're asking, but I think so. I mean, I don't think that we can be doing this type of work in the city's backyard or front yard, depending on how you look at it, without city involvement.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
If there are no other questions, and my contact information, when I send the map to Scott, you can send that out too. So feel free to let me know if you have questions. Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Yeah.
Thanks, Becky.
Thank you very much. Okay. This is a public hearing today, and one of the purposes that we have of holding these meetings is to get input from the public. So at this point, I would like to open the meeting up for public comment. Anyone who would like to comment on anything, please come forward. We'd love to hear from you.
Hello.
Give us your name.
My name is Brom Webb. I reside at 290 Sienna Street. And I was going to ask if you could pull up figure 1.2 of the Morro Bay Draft General Plan. And now, if that's not possible, what that is your vicinity map. And on that vicinity map, you're missing Highway 46. So if we could include that, it would be a very advantageous to show the proper representation of the area. So I don't know how we go forward with that, but that would be something I think that you would advise them to say, yes, we need to have nomenclature for Highway 46 on the vicinity map.
Do you mean 41 or
46.
46?
Yes.
Okay.
So basically it would look something like this. Pardon me. If that's correct.
It's in the county.
And talking about it, looks like that might be appropriate. It might be a change we make that makes sense. It does give context and from a locational standpoint. Yeah. That's a good idea.
Yeah, good suggestion.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to pass this down to Scott, so he'll have it for reference.
Do whatever you would like. And then I guess my second point would be is that on Chapter 2, section or page 8, it states that the Morro Bay does not record data for particular matter. We're talking about the air. And so with that said, you turn around and you use the city of San Luis Obispo's data. And what I would like to see you all say is that we would like have Morro Bay have an air monitoring program instead of sitting here using the city of San Luis Obispo's data, which you should use in the county general plan. But I think Morro Bay needs to start to monitor their own air quality. So that would be another issue that you would have to then state to them that you would want that to be a part of the general plan. Because that's basically what the tool of the general plan would be, is in one of the elements being the air, that you could basically state that Morro Bay could implement a air monitoring program. So now, with that said, I don't know which way. It was easy enough to get Highway 46 thrown on there. But I figured the air monitoring program was going to be a little bit more.
I think what we're going to do is take your input under advisement.
Okay.
And I don't anticipate that we'll have a response for you.
That's fine.
Immediately.
All right.
Is it okay to ask a question?
Why don't we save them all to the
Okay.
end?
All right. Thank you very much.
Betty Winholtz, would you clarify if this is public comment and then we'll be talking about the agenda items later, or do we all do all our comments now?
All your comments now.
All comments now. Okay, Betty Winholtz. With regard to the air pollution thing, we used to monitor our air here when the power plant was running, and so we do have that facility somewhere in, I think it was on top of the police station, unless that's been taken down. So it was at one point we were doing that, so I don't know why they stopped. Number two, the pink space or purple, whatever you want to call it, that was on your map that showed the hillsides, and there was some concern about being able to see houses on the ridge line. Both the county has a viewshed ordinance and the city has a viewshed ordinance where the hills in North Morro Bay, at least in the current one, unless you change it, says that you can't put houses on top of the ridge, and that the ridge line the houses have to be below the ridge. So I would remind you of that. And then with regard to the two items that I read about that you're dealing with today, the land use that dealt with the land use had to do with zoning, and I find it confusing, even though I'm quite familiar with our land use now, and you're putting on new designations. Unless you can go, piece by piece for me and show me, and I've asked this before, if that's okay, can you show me where R1 falls inside the new category? Where does R2 fall inside the new category? In other words, if you could give us a column on how things are changing with the titles and where the old thing fits inside the new titles, that would be real helpful. And then with regard to the sea level rise, I was a little bit surprised about what items you said should be looked at. This Chevron property, to me, is pretty elevated. When we had our flooding in the 90s, as some of you were here for, you know that where we flooded was across Highway 1 and Main Street at 41 in Main. That's not even talked about in here. And that, to me, is what you need to talk about in terms of sea level rise. And certainly, your talk about Caltrans or Highway 1 impacts us, but that really is Caltrans' problem, not ours. What our problem is going to be Main Street. And it seems to me you need to address Main Street and sea level rise. And the other piece, I'm trying to remember about the sea level rise, was the Rock parking lot and the Embarcadero. And from what I gathered in your reading of the Embarcadero, it sounds like there's really not an issue there, that's kind of taken care of already except for the utilities. And that's something that the Planning Commission can deal with as it approves new projects and make sure that that's taken care of. And I just want to say I'm pleased that we didn't talk about any kind of protection, that it's either about the middle word, which I forgot starts with an A. Accommodation, thank you, and or retreat, because I'm really about retreat. And Ventura has been doing that for a number of years, and they're doing a good job with it. And I think there's a good example for us to do that. I don't know if that's a bell or not. Seems like there was one more thing, but I think those are the biggies. Thank you. Oh, cloisters. Seems to me you need to talk about cloisters. You've dealt with other kinds of impact to sea level, but they're under sea level, and that's not listed in there at all either. And that was a surprise. Thanks.
Good afternoon, members. I'm Carol Truesdale, and I live in North Morro Bay. On the attachment number 4, which is your land use alternatives, I really think that high density residential on the old Texaco property is really not a positive for North Morro Bay. I think that needs to be reduced to a medium density residential versus high. We have traffic issues right now. We have an impact there, and bringing in all that into North Morro Bay is really not a good thing. So thank you for hearing me.
Where's the old Texaco?
solid brown on the map.
Good evening. Barbara Dorr, resident, homeowner since '93. I did provide written input to all of you, so I'm not going to read it all. On the Chevron property, I hope that the county is very, very actively involved in preserving that land. Sure, we want to say so, but I believe they've got the oversight. And on the primary, I would support more of the secondary goals. If you're looking for statewide grants, we're not just looking at a separation between two cities or a place to walk dogs. This is a valuable habitat that should remain along a scenic highway. And if you have anything to say, or if you put any input in on the wastewater treatment plant, or WRF, I would hope that you might suggest the area adjacent to the PG&E switching station. I mean, as long as it's devastated by that, put something else in that's devastating, and then add a buffer zone. The FAR, I do have to emphasize that. I think it's critical that we have an FAR in residential, so we control what we can build on a lot. We went to visit family in Reno for a vacation, and I always listen to NPR, and they were talking about a community and some developers in various places in the U.S. that were building subdivisions with less than 2,000 square feet homes and requiring that. And it was very popular, and they were selling the homes. So if you have an FAR and you define a box, you keep your setbacks. You don't allow your administrator to give administrative variances to the setback. You keep the sides, you keep the front, and you keep the rear 20 foot or whatever it is. Don't let the big decks be built over looking down at property or intruding into their privacy, and it forces a buildable box that might be more affordable and compatible with our neighborhoods. So I hope you would apply the FAR. And also, the size of a lot should naturally limit the size of the structure. The problem is too many people want to maximize the buildable space on their lot, and it's really not fair to all of our community. And if you have a larger lot, you can build a larger home. If you have a smaller lot, you build a smaller home. Non-conforming uses, please come up with some standards that apply to the residential non-conforming uses rather than site-by-site exceptions. Oh, and before I go on, there's a lot to read. You know, I tried reading some of your comments from different members, and reading the reports, it's impossible. And I would suggest that you have a similar public comment as is done by the City Council. Public comment at the beginning, and each of your agenda items provide information of time for public comment. And you should have agendas in the lobby. It's a public meeting, and there's no agendas for the public attending. And I actually thank you very much for updating your baseline report for Parks and Recreation for Parks Lands, putting acreage, putting who owns it. I think it's a better understanding of the limited amount of space we have, open space in this city for active recreation for kids. I have an 11-year-old grandson who's actively involved in sports, and I think the old Morrill site, it's an active recreation for our kids. At Coleman Park, families go down and play basketball, and that basketball court, it's used by the community. Do something to preserve that. You should have a parkette category. You still show Mariners Park as an acre. I mean, we're out of color ink, sorry, but it's a tiny little space. It's barely 2 parking spaces wide. If Anchor Park is 0.6 acres, this one is certainly much smaller. And on the Chevron property, I agree with the lady before on the high-density zoning. You're giving it away to Chevron, use it as a bargaining chip. But aside from that, our grandson went to Del Mar. There's a lot of young families. They don't have much money, and all the Airbnb, short-term rentals are taking the nice little houses away from those families. Barcelona, Spain, is doing something because property values are being based on Airbnb, short-term rental value, and not the value for a purchase in a living family. but actually you should lower that density. That's outrageous. If you're going to have it a high density, get some low-income residential, because the families need it. You want affordable housing? We don't have it. We want to have our economy enhanced. We need workers, we need housing, and we need places for young people. Downtown, please, and the Embarcadero.
Barbara, I think you may be going a little past
And do
here.
something about Centennial Park. We don't have a drought anymore. The city should be ashamed. I mean, it's just a dried up grass. It's a teeny tiny patch. Keep it nice for locals and residents. And I know that's not your purview. Thank you.
Richard Sadowski. I agree with the earlier speaker regarding the sea level rise. Shouldn't be worrying about Highway 1. That's Caltrans. Cloisters, for sure. Cloisters are an issue, and so is the critical infrastructure. And Embarcadero, as far as that goes, it looks like it's okay. However, residential, you got to look at residential. We have, like in North Point, we have houses that already, not even during king tide, stream bluffs are being impacted by the ocean there. So that's something that we should be looking at. Regarding the panorama project above, like in where it's going to be a low density R1, maybe right above panorama in the North Morro Bay area, and the high density in the area of North Morro Bay, let's be very clear that that sewer main is already over capacity. Okay, already. In 2007, the city had sent a letter to residents stating that. And that sewer line, the people that live there right now should not be subsidizing development. So any development that goes down should be surcharged in what it's going to take to upsize that line. And that also, that 60-40 line, which is 60% Morro Bay, 40% Cayucas capacity. It's the one that ties all of North Morro Bay in, and is the one that's leaching into a drinking water aquifer there at Highway 41 and Main Street. Is going to have to be part of the EIR for the wastewater treatment project, or the water reclamation project. That's by a letter from Coastal back in about 2010. So that's something that we have to keep in mind when you're doing any negotiating. Keep in mind that line's going to have to be upsized. And the other major issue regarding, there's an announcement that we recently, I just found out we have gotten a Water Infrastructure Finance and Innovation Act loan from the US EPA that came through Cal EPA and down to us. So we're working on getting a project that can help. One of the timing issues that came out of this is because we're looking at a plant near the existing wastewater treatment plant. I've always been a proponent of the concrete plant, and I think that and here's my frustration. I've been on WRF-CAC for 2 years, and for 2 years I've been asking them, what are they going to do with the lift station? And that is a huge issue. Now, land use, people say, well, what are we going to do putting a wastewater treatment plant? Land use change. You're going to have one anyway if you put in a lift station the size of a small house. Now, those of you who know anything about power usage, when you have pumps that kick on every 20 minutes and spike, the maintenance and operation cost of a lift station to pump sewage out of the city is huge. So take a look at the what we're working on. We've got a 2-month time frame right now to look at a package unit that we can put on west of Highway 1, and I would suggest that you could look at and get on Morro Bay, www.morrobaywrf.info, and you can get some more information on it. Thanks.
Thank you, Richard. Anyone else?
I just have a question on procedures.
Yes, ma'am.
I was going to write it and leave it. Barbara Dorr again. Why does this committee not follow the public comment rules and procedures that the City Council follows, and I believe every other other board or commission in the city?
We do.
You have one public comment. I don't. Why is it different? Why is it one public comment and no comment on agenda items?
Okay, if you'll
That's my question.
have a seat, I'll close public comment and we'll address that as well as other questions and comments. So let's start out. Are there any questions for any of the speakers? Yeah.
I had a quick question about the air monitoring. What is the status of that? Do we just not do any air? Is no air monitoring done in the city at all?
I don't know the answer to that.
Okay, it does seem, and given there are issues around places where there are dunes and beaches and particulate issues around Napomo and other areas, it does seem wise to at least have some kind of sampling program.
I know we used to monitor when the plant was operational, and
That may have been funded by the plant. I don't know.
Yeah,
So that
I'm not aware
yeah.
that we do it now. I don't think that we do, but I don't know that for sure.
It would seem like it's sort of a sensible thing to do every once in a while, at least. So anyway, just a thought.
Any other questions? A couple of comments. With regard to the land use map and the categories on the land use map, this is the land use map. Okay, these are land use categories. R1, R2, R3 are zoning categories. They're on the zoning map. So there is no correspondence between medium density residential and a zoning category because you're comparing apples and oranges. Okay, so if you the issue of R1, R2, the manufacturing, visitor dependent, commercial, those are all zoning categories, not land use categories. So they don't appear on this map. They will appear on the zoning map, and I suspect that they will be substantially different than our current zoning categories, particularly with regard to some of the commercial uses and some of the commercial categories.
But Chair Teft, could I comment that there is a table in our agenda packet, table attachment 4 to the packet shows the land use categories and the corresponding zoning categories as was being asked for. So in terms of the existing zoning categories and the land use designations, they are in a table that people can see now.
But that's a general correspondence,
right?
That is not. They don't necessarily. That's not necessarily true. It's kind of a general idea, but it's not necessarily the way it's going to be.
Well, it may not remain the way it is, but today, in today's system and with the system we're proposing of today's, the land use designations, that's the correspondence that the consultants have identified would be the case. And I think it's a really important point because to me it's hard to consider land use designations without thinking about corresponding zoning designations.
Well, again, I think that you're looking at a number of new zoning designations which have not yet been defined. So
don't disagree.
I would be cautious with that.
I'd also like to provide a clarification. Jeff just informed me that we do have a monitoring station. It just doesn't monitor particulate matter. So,
what's it monitoring?
What does it monitor?
Probably nitric oxide.
Amy's got the table in front of her. I'll give her a moment to take a look at that. But the station monitors the remaining criteria pollutants that are essentially regulated by the state and federal government, but this particular station, it appears, is not equipped to monitor particulate matter. And so what the report does is it uses particulate matter measurements from San Luis Obispo, which is the nearest station that does monitor particulate matter.
So even when the power plant was operating, they weren't monitoring particulate matter?
That I don't know. But the current condition is that there is a station that's maintained by the Air District that does monitor the remaining criteria pollutants.
Okay. It doesn't seem like sort of a sensible thing to monitor. Just particularly if there's actually equipment there, but they're not using it. Maybe equipment from when the power plant was operating.
And then in terms of public comment policy, there is a scheduled public comment period at the beginning of each meeting. There are certain items on the agenda for GPAC, for Planning Commission, for City Council, which are designated as public hearing items. And for those, a public comment period is scheduled for each item. For other items, such as the consent calendar, unfinished business, closing comments, etc., it is not scheduled.
And there's no agenda packet to look at to even discuss it.
We do have one, and we keep the agendas up front, and then we post it online.
I've read it online.
With that, then, we will move on to our consent calendar, item A1, which is approval of the minutes from GPAC meeting of May 18th, 2017. Is there any discussion on item A1? Do we have a motion, then, to approve the consent calendar?
I move to approve the consent calendar.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. Is there any discussion on the motion? Seeing none, all in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries unanimously. We have no public hearing items or unfinished business this evening, so we will move on to new business, item C1, which includes presentations from Michael Baker International, and I will turn this over to Scott for introductions or comments.
I think I'll just turn it directly over to Jeff Henderson sitting next to me to start us off.
Thank you, Scott. And I'm going to quickly do our status update and then turn it over to Amy for our first agenda item. Quick update on status of the project. Draft. We are busy at work preparing the draft plan document at this point itself. So the Plan Morro Bay document, which is the integrated general plan and local coastal program, and working from a lot of the dialogue that's occurred before this committee, as well as some of the direction that we've received from the Planning Commission and the City Council. What's up next for us is the GPAC's review of the land use and mobility policies component of that document, which would come forward in a very early form. I believe we're looking toward our second meeting in August to bring that information to you and discuss it. And then we're also looking at our first meeting in August agenda to present some work that Amy and I have had some interactions with our subconsultant Rincon, who is preparing an updated ESHA layer for the city. That is one of the components of our Round 3 Coastal Commission local coastal program grant. So we've seen some early versions of that, and we're in the process of modifying that. We'll be presenting that to staff for review, and then intend to present that to the GPAC at our meeting on, I believe it's the 17th of August. So those are the parts of the plan that are moving forward. We're also going to bring to that same meeting on the 17th the administrative provisions portion of the draft zoning code. So RRM has been hard at work on that portion of the zoning code, and we'll be bringing those administrative processes portions to the GPAC for review in August. All of this is leading us toward, as soon as we can, moving forward with the notice of preparation that will initiate the CEQA process for the general plan update. The key piece to that is really, getting the continued input on the land use classification system, marrying that with the guidance that we've received now from the Planning Commission and the Council regarding preferred land use plan, to move into a development capacity that it's associated with that plan. That completes the pieces that are necessary for us to complete a project description for the NOP, which then will kick off the CEQA portion of the project. Would remind everybody we are moving forward aggressively toward a Coastal Commission deadline of December 2018. to wrap up this project. So, this is now entering that stage where we're moving toward the completion documents and the public review of those documents, and then presentation of them to the Coastal Commission and the City Council in the opposite order, to the City Council and to the Coastal Commission. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Amy, who's going to do a brief presentation on our final presentation of the Community Baseline Assessment document.
Thanks, Jeff. So let me refresh everyone's memory. It's been a while. We last brought the draft Community Baseline Assessment to you in September of last year, and at that time we decided to hold off on finishing it, mostly due to some updated information that was being worked on economic conditions in analysis in the city. So since then, we have received that updated information, or it has been completed. We also received some comments from you and from the public, and there are revisions made based on all of those things. You have a track change version, so you can see where they were specifically made. Most of them were in Chapter 5, which is the Economic Conditions and Market Trends chapter. And there are some in other places as well. So we're looking for any final questions or things that seem like this can't be finalized without. But this is the final presentation on this, as we are now moving into drafting the plan, as Jeff said. And this is our background that we're basing that on.
Right. Yes, this document will affect both the sort of the baseline conditions summaries that are a part of the plan itself, which will be very, very short and not as, let's say, quantitative as this report is. Because, again, the plan document is meant to not necessarily be timeless, but not be fixed at a point in time either. So in that sense, a more general presentation of this information will be carried forward in various sections of the plan. The more important contribution of this document is toward the environmental impact report, because it also describes the existing conditions, which is representative of the existing environment that we then look at the impact of the plan against. So that's essentially sort of where this information goes next.
Okay, any question? I have a question. So I'm not sure I understand the process. So you're updating the draft from last September, but so are we going to see it again in draft form? Will there be another opportunity to review and comment, or I'm not? And when would that be?
No, where this information will appear next is in the context of the environmental impact report and the plan. So it will not be yet another community baseline assessment document. What we're doing is essentially using this document to assemble all the existing conditions information that will then be placed in those other documents.
Okay, and when do we see those again?
Those are ultimately in the public review process down the road. So, I mean, we have not yet.
We don't have the schedule for that yet. Okay, that's what I was asking. Okay.
Are you asking about the final assessment?
The next document, next time we see this, okay, the document that it's in, when might that happen?
Kind of the final draft is in your packet for tonight, and we heard one comment to add the identification of Highway 46. So if there are any other things like that, we'll make those edits, and then it will be final at that point.
Okay. So this is, so when you're saying this is coming, this is here. That's what we have now. Okay. I thank you. I wasn't quite clear on that.
I guess at this point, if there are no additional revisions requested from the GPAC, we can move to our next item.
With regard to the CBA, I have a question. In terms of the coastal vulnerability assessments, do those, we've heard a few comments from the audience about previous storm conditions. Do these take into account storm surges and or is this simply sort of the day-to-day effect of sea level rise?
Right. We do have Brian Leslie with us this evening from Moffitt and Nickel, who happened to be integrally involved in the preparation of that vulnerability assessment. I mean, we could certainly take that now, or Brian could address it in his upcoming presentation, whatever your preference.
Well, I can wait. Yeah, it's fine.
In the interest of...
I think maybe now it's good because the next presentation really focuses on adaptation more than the vulnerability.
I don't think your mic's on.
Your mic doesn't seem to be on.
Or talking to it. Now good? Now good? Testing?
It's not. It's, the light's on. But.
It's on.
Okay.
There you go.
All right. So the presentation really focuses on adaptation. So this is probably a good time to talk about the vulnerability assessment. So the vulnerability assessment did look at storms, storm waves. So it looked at today's conditions. So beaches like in 2014 is based on best available topo. And then we modeled waves on top of that, how waves would erode the beach and run up the beach. So the short answer is yes, we did consider storm surge, large wave events like a 100-year wave condition, which is up here, very large, like 30-foot waves kind of thing. So
those were included or were not?
We're included in the mapping of those hazards.
Thank you. Very good. Then a couple other comments. In terms of the infrastructure section, in terms of the healthcare issues, I didn't see any comment about mental health facilities or substance abuse treatment facilities. And it seems to me, particularly in light of what's happening with opioids these days, that those are significant considerations. And also with regard to infrastructure, and we kind of discussed this tangentially in the past, but I didn't see any comment with regard to facilities for homeless shelters or for victims of domestic violence. And again, I think those are important components. And if we don't have them, I think it's equally important to identify that as a need.
I'm not sure if all of that was in there, but they certainly identified the numbers of sheltered and unsheltered homeless in the city, and so identifying that suggests probably that there's something we need to be doing at a policy level.
I'm aware of that, but I think we need to look not only at the individuals, but what the facilities are and what the facility needs are.
I think it did talk about what the facilities were too, as I recall.
Okay. Great. So we're prepared to, I think, move to a presentation I'm very much looking forward to. The sea level rise adaptation analysis. Again, I'll introduce Brian Leslie with Moffitt and Nickel, who will guide you through both sort of the intent of the analysis and the outcomes.
Great. Thank you, Jeff. Okay, starting with study goals. As I mentioned, this built off our vulnerability assessment. It was a subsequent grant from the Coastal Commission to look at 3 sites within the city and how sea level rise adaptation could be rolled out at those sites. Those sites were strategically picked to be able to be extrapolated across larger reaches of the city and inform the LCP. So these sites were selected based on coordination with city staff and conversations with the Coastal Commission, so they weren't just decided within a vacuum. The 3 sites we selected were Highway 1 on the north end of town, the Morro Rock parking lot, and the Embarcadero waterfront. Sure.
I don't know if you want to take questions at the end or
No, this
interrupt.
is great.
There were a couple people who mentioned the cloisters. I was just wondering if that came up in the conversation.
A residential option was considered, and we threw out a number of different sites, and we decided against a residential site within.
People live there?
I defer to the city, perhaps, Scott.
Well, when we looked at the map and the areas, there's hardened facilities in these areas, and those are the ones that are typically of more importance to the Coastal Commission and how we're dealing with those. hardened facilities both in relationship to the highway, in relationship to the rock parking lot area, the riprap, and then the revetments in the harbor. Those tend to be the areas of most concern when you have hardened improvements that stop the natural erosion process. Those tend to be the things that are most interesting to the Coastal Commission. The other areas, we're still going to have policies that relate to it because we have sea level rise analysis that shows us over time what impacts will be, and we'll develop policy that's related to that. But we looked at these specific areas because these have hardened improvements in them. And so there's some limitations to what we can do there, and we need to go through and determine what would be appropriate options for dealing with sea level rise in those instances.
I'm not sure I understand the rationale. So the idea is that you've already got hardened facilities there and you're looking to see if they need to be improved?
Improved, removed. We have to, allow retreat, managed retreat, or what we're doing with those. Those things are a little bit easier when you don't have the hardened improvements in place. Then we can come up with policies that deal with the if there are impacts from sea level rise in relationship to the areas where our housing is located. We can come up with strategies that deal with that because the Coastal Commission is not really in favor of hardened improvements, and we know that. And so the adaptation strategies for those areas will be slightly different, likely, than in these areas where we have the hardened improvements. Were we to allow the area like the rock parking lot to go away, well, that would have a dramatic impact to our harbor because wave energy would enter the harbor. And so those are issues there. Okay. Those are the questions that we want to have answered if that was okay for us to protect those areas or not, because those are some pretty serious conversations that you start to have if the expectation is that area is going to go away. And so that's why we chose those locations primarily.
Okay, so where would those other things, the other areas, be addressed? Where there's also vulnerabilities, but they're not hardened at this point.
They'll be addressed as it relates to sea level rise overall, and if there's housing areas where there's housing that would potentially be impacted through the life of the document, or even beyond, because we did the study will go out to 100 years. Then we'll develop adaptation strategies that go along with that. The Coastal Commission will require us to do that. Tell us what's going to happen in those areas, like along Beachcomber and those types of places. So.
Right. Maybe just a point of clarification. The intent of this was not to say these are the only locations where we're exploring adaptation options. The intent of this portion of study was, to this point, we've developed a vulnerability assessment. We know where our vulnerabilities are. We know what assets are most vulnerable. The intent of this was to identify a few locations and consider the range of options for those locations. It wasn't to identify the full stretch and the full range of mitigation. That's a step the city will need to continue to evaluate and to do. The intent of this was to identify those individual locations and say, based on what we understand the vulnerability to be, what are the options we have here, and here.
Was the focus intentionally on public areas?
Not intentionally, no.
But it does seem that this would, if it's approved by Coastal, that you can do whatever is chosen to be, the best path. It gives a precedent-setting strategy, so that Coastal would approve in our general plan this act for this kind of coastal erosion problem or whatever. So I would think you could extrapolate that to if it ever came to a threat, say, to the Cloisters area, then those kinds of activities, you could say, well, you allowed it up here at Highway 1 and down here at the Rock. So can we protect these communities with a similar thing?
Right. And I think that was Brian's point about sort of being able to extrapolate, if you will, from the solutions in this condition to, well, first off, elsewhere in Morro Bay, and then secondly, from the Coastal Commission's perspective, to other similar locations with similar issues throughout the state.
So I understand the concept of having the 3 study areas and so forth. I'm not sure why Highway 1 is in it, since that's state land. But I would think the Coastal Commission would be concerned about critical infrastructure, which right now is a desalination plant, plus the water treatment plant, as well as the substation. And I think they need to be in this document. Coastal needs to see it now. I think it'll be in our advantage to have that now, as opposed to something we have to deal with in the future and go back to Coastal for another permit, et cetera, et cetera. And I agree that residential areas need to be part of this study as well. and there's not a residential area in the study, which for everyone I talk to is kind of like, well, what about us? So, and then my last thought about an area to look at is the sand spit. If there is substantial sea level rise and large storms and so forth, what is the impact on the bay and the Embarcadero if the sand spit erodes completely? That's just a thought I had. So I think it makes sense to put as much as we can. I know it's a general plan, but put as much as we can of the areas that are going to need to be protected or might deteriorate as a result of sea level rise.
Yeah, I agree. Okay. So to go back and just to give some context about sea level rise projections in the vulnerability assessment and within this adaptation strategy and adaptation planning, we looked at the best available science for the West Coast of the United States, which is the National Research Council in 2012. Basically what that study, that scientific publication found is that we should expect on the high end 2 feet of sea level rise by 2050 and 5.5 feet by 2100. There is now another scientific piece of literature out there that is gaining some traction and probably going to be adopted by the state shortly, which has some new projections, and that's what's shown in those little circles there. And basically everything's in agreement through 2050, but as you get past 2050 into 2100, the numbers move a bit to the north. And on the high end in 2100, we see about 6 feet of sea level rise, and they also included a worst case scenario for 2100, which is 10 feet. That is like catastrophic, everything goes wrong type of scenario. There are probabilities attached to each one of these sea level rise projections. Everything except for this red dot, the 10 foot, that's just, there's no probabilities. It's a very low probability event through 2150. So anyways, we had those larger projections in the back of our head as we're doing this study. Spots like the Embarcadero that don't really have problems for a while. We wanted to kind of consider what something catastrophic might look like and what we might do. As far as the strategies that we considered, we looked at protection, and protection can take both hard and soft forms. As was mentioned earlier, the Coastal Commission is more in favor of softer forms of protection as opposed to hardened seawalls, revetments, traditional forms of protection. It's kind of out of vogue with them at the moment. So hybrid solutions like dunes on top of revetments or just straight dunes are more favorable. We also looked at accommodation strategies. Can the facility or asset bounce back after flooding? So be designed so it can withstand such flooding events. And we also looked at retreat, manage retreat options where they make sense. What we found is a really important part of this conversation is the cost to adaptation, both initial cost of doing something and life cycle cost. So we looked at costs over 20 years for these different types of structures, and these are very rough order of magnitude numbers, costs tied to each one of these strategies, very back of the envelope, but just kind of give you order of magnitude cost for doing things. In Morro Bay, you guys have some site-specific advantages, if you will. You have access to a lot of sand. The Corps, it looks like they're out there right now, dredging every year 200,000 cubic yards of sand. That sand can be used to help you guys. I mean, you have great dunes already, but you can use that to maybe bolster your dunes, build beaches, do some of these soft forms of protection. As I mentioned, you have these dunes. The dunes do a great job of shoreline protection. They are naturally resilient, and they provide a reservoir of sand to the beaches. So great for coastal storm damage protection. You also have space in a lot of areas. Southern California doesn't have this luxury. They're pinned up right against the coastline. You guys have some space to work with. So we'll talk about some of those things. We're going to walk through each one of our sites. The first site is Highway 1. And just some rough kind of site characteristics I'll go through. It's about 22 feet NAVD 88 at its lowest point. It's heavily traveled, about 25,000 average daily trips as of 2015. I'm sure it's a bit north of that by now. has been mentioned, it's a Caltrans-owned highway, so that adds a little wrinkle into what you can do there. But and there's also county land to the immediate east. There's just a finger of land that's owned by the city there, and immediately to the east, it's owned by Chevron and the county. So that's another wrinkle. There is a revetment in place along 550 feet of that reach. Don't know much history about that structure. Be interested to learn more about that. Assume there was. That's an area of vulnerability. Obviously, the highway is probably getting undermined at some point. The site is subject to coastal waves, and waves here are large, and that's something we consider within our vulnerability assessment and with our adaptation planning, is that this thing needs to be pretty robust to withstand those waves. So this is a summary of our vulnerability assessment. We found in 2050 that the highway is vulnerable to flooding and bluff erosion. And within our numerical modeling that we did to prepare these mapped vulnerable areas, we assumed that the shoreline protection was not in place as a conservative estimate of where these hazards may lie.
Right? Could I interrupt just for a second?
Of course.
When you made these maps, what sea level rise number were you using to generate the maps?
Yeah. So for 2050, that was 2 feet.
Okay.
And for 2100, that was 5.5 feet.
Okay. Thanks.
So that was our still water level, and then we added those large waves on top of that, which adds a significant amount of water.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm. So we threw, and I just want to say, in our scenario development and the different adaptation options that are being presented, these are us throwing ideas against the wall and definitely open for discussion. So scenario one is a protection approach, starting with green or soft forms of protection and migrating into hardening forms of protection. Our first step would be triggered by overwash of the roadway causing temporary closures multiple times a year, something like that, or roadway undermining, destabilizing the roadway, at which point we'd recommend constructing a dune. There's already a small dune in place for a segment of that breach, so it would be extending that dune north and south, increasing the elevation and making this similar to some of the other dunes you see in the city. Not quite as high, but something like that.
What's that little rectangular area there?
Yeah, so what color is that? Yellow-brown? That is the dune footprint, roughly. And that would be about 40,000 cubic yards of sand. The idea with that was it would be a piggyback on the core project to capture some of that sand that's coming out of the annual maintenance dredging. A lot of
is that the Chevron bulkhead wall, that rectangular part? That's what I was trying to...
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry.
Thanks.
So that's shown, and also the blue line is the existing revetment that's in place. There's rock in place there. So yeah, the idea is to piggyback on the core project. A lot of other coastal jurisdictions that we work with have successfully done that to get really low-cost sand to their beaches. So that's a really good opportunity for you guys. I think that's been done in the past, I think in 2005. So the dune starts things off, and that continues until that doesn't work anymore. The dune is not sustained. It starts getting eroded frequently, and for whatever reason, it gets overtopped, erodes, and keeping sand out there on the dune doesn't work anymore. At that point, we recommend, in this scenario, we'd extend the revetment, basically in either direction, from the Chevron bulkhead wall to Toro Creek, and also from the existing revetment to the north to meet that bulkhead wall, assuming that bulkhead wall stays in place. This revetment would be matching the existing design, which doesn't carry all the way to the existing grade of the roadway, so it probably goes to like plus 17, where the roadway's at plus 22. So we kind of carry that in all directions, and that would be in place until that starts getting overtopped and maybe some of the backland starts getting eroded, at which point the revetment gets raised to maybe at elevation with the roadway, if not a little bit higher than it, to to help you with sea level rise estimates in the 2100 timeframe, like 5.5 feet or beyond.
Does this plan speak as to who, because this is the state highway, does this plan speak to who pays for this or who would do this, or are these just actions that could be taken but not necessarily by whom?
That's it, the latter.
That's what
yeah.
There are also actions that can be taken. The properties directly south of this are the houses off of Toro. This would be directly applicable. These scenarios would be directly applicable to those because it's similar armoring.
That's right.
With regard to the triggers, the triggers for action is trigger for the dune construction would be roadway flooding and damage. But what we've seen further north on Highway 1 is that the damage has been catastrophic and kind of all at once. So how do we know that these triggers would allow action to be taken in a timely fashion to prevent that sort of failure?
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I don't have a perfect answer for that, except for that trigger could be defined by the city in whatever action you think is, or whatever metrics you think that make the most sense. So if you have a minimum beach width, for example, like your beach is historically a historic minimum, like a 50 feet or something like that. Like I was out there today, and the beach looked like 100 and something feet wide. So if you get down to like 20 feet in width, you're just approaching your winter, and you're like, there's gonna be a problem here this year. That could be a trigger to act. So we loosely define them and kind of generically define them at the moment, but we can add some more detail to that as it makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's an important discussion, because we don't want to be Ragged Point at some time in the future.
And that seems more of something related to slide activity than water coming in. Although maybe that's naive, but there you have very, very steep hills, and you have a lot of that. A lot of the problem has not been that the water's come in; it's that the lane has come down, and it seems like much more of an elevation issue there than here. But maybe that's not.
Perhaps. My point is simply that we want to have enough warning that we don't have, that our first roadway damage isn't, both lanes are at the bottom of the ocean.
Yeah.
I think we've seen in certain kinds of storm years that the beach cutting, that it comes in really far and undercuts it pretty dramatically. At least you can see that from the rock. So if that were happening closer to Highway 1 up the coast, you're going to lose the road because it's going to undercut it and it will collapse. So it makes sense to look at that beach width, in my mind, as a trigger.
I know there's probably going to be a heck of a lot of technical analysis that goes on between this and a concrete plan in terms of cost, in terms of effectiveness, in terms of I just want to make sure that we have enough lead time to take care of the problem before it leaves us isolated.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a great point. Okay, scenario 2 was a horizontal retreat option. This option is to physically relocate the roadway to the east and realign the road. What constraints with this option were a couple. It is controlled by the bridge on the north end. We want to, for this option, leave that in place. And with the speed of the roadway and the turning radiuses that are required, it kind of made this shape that you see here. Doesn't give us as much retreat, kind of bang for your buck, if you will, as far as getting out of harm's way. But anyways, this would provide you some space and accommodate some level of additional coastal hazards. So essentially this would be a no action until some things are seen in the out there, whether minimum beach width or some sort of overtopping, things like that, at which point, or maybe a major capital improvement or something that Caltrans is doing to start the planning for this new roadway.
It it seems like when you do something like this, the studies involved and the preparation to move a major highway in like that was something that you really, you wouldn't necessarily want to wait till you're starting to have problems. You'd have to really start it before you had problems.
Yeah, I agree.
And in fact, many years before, in order to prepare.
Right, I agree. So maybe it lines up better with coordinating with Caltrans so you understand where their next steps are for that roadway or things like that. The third scenario is a vertical retreat option. This would be to carry the existing bridge at Toro Creek to the south. And I forget the exact number, but 1,000-something feet until it kind of gets behind that cliff-backed shoreline to the south. So similar to the realigning of the roadway, I fully agree that this would take quite a significant planning effort and it would need to be started early. The idea is to build this bridge and remove the shoreline protection that's in place, except for short protection around the bridge abutments. So there would still need to be protection around Toro Creek on the north end, and on the south end of this bridge, there need to be some wraparound protection for the abutment. Second site that we looked at was a Moore Rock parking lot. Some general site characteristics here is that we have about plus 15 feet of elevation at the revetment crest and the parking lot pad. As everyone knows, it's a reclaimed land. It's important to keep the navigation channel going. It is a high recreational amenity, important asset to the city. It's subject to waves similar to Highway 1 site and complicated coastal dynamics. The former Dynegy outfall and also just having that short perpendicular revetment and behind the rock, there's a rip current that runs there, and it's just more complicated because it's not a straight stretch of coastline. So those are things we were thinking about during the planning for this. As far as the vulnerability assessment, we found that in 2050 it's vulnerable to flooding. In 2100, we expect more of that. So you can see that with the light blue and the dark blue shading. The first scenario we looked at was a retreat type of option, where the first step would be to retreat within the existing parking lot pad. The retreat options would formalize the parking lot. Right now it's informal parking over a large space. This idea would be to consolidate and formalize parking, provide a sufficient amount within a smaller pad. And so the first step would be to move onto a safe location within that existing pad. And then the second step would be to relocate somewhere landward, somewhere to the east along the Embarcadero. So these were just kind of dummy locations, the ones that we think, at least in step one, kind of makes sense, but step two could be anywhere, essentially, and just provide pedestrian connection to the beach and to the Moore Rock. Scenario two is a retreat and protect option. The idea is to retreat the parking lot, elevate the parking lot by 6 to 8 feet. So it would be similar to alternative scenario one, where we'd formalize parking within a smaller footprint, pull it back, raise it so it can accommodate these greater levels of sea level rise. So that would be the first step. And then as water levels start to approach this elevated pad, a dune could be constructed in front of it. This dune could be kind of like an extension of what's to the north, just kind of keeping this elevation of plus 22 or 30 of those dune systems. Could also be a recreational area, could be a habitat area, could be a lot of things, passive recreation. At some point on these high sea level rise scenarios, the dune might break down, the existing revetment might start breaking down. At that point, the concept was to realign and raise this revetment. What that would do is give coastals, kind of a give and take, a little bit of goodwill by moving back. You'd have some beach, you'd allow some beach area to be captured by that. And you would fortify, raise that revetment by a certain distance so you could sustain and protect the parking lot against these high rates of sea level rise.
It seems like that this is sort of a different thing than the highway. The highway is used regularly and going to be used all the time. If you've got, if you're throwing 30-foot waves on top of sea level rise here, it seems like this would be, I think we talked about, if something flooded and then you could recover. I mean, first of all, you wouldn't expect it to be heavily used in the middle of giant storms.
True.
And if it was temporarily not available and then the storm was done, you could then possibly go and use it again, maybe? Is that the idea? It seems to be very different from some of these things that are used on a regular basis that have to be operational in the middle of storms, whereas maybe this is not as critical in the middle of a storm.
Yeah, I agree. It'd be more of an accommodation thing where it could be flooded and bounce straight back. So it could handle the water that would come onto the parking lot.
With regard to scenario 1, have you looked to see what areas are available to the east that are not dune habitat, that are not ESHA? Because an awful lot of that area in there is in fact ESHA.
Right. Yeah, I noticed that. I noticed that probably wasn't the best site. We need to find a better site. It'd be like a siting study to kind of understand where the best place for that might be. Like maybe on the former Dynegy site, like a little sliver could be cut away for this, or a number of different areas.
And also, with regard to, it looks as if by 2100, there are going to be substantial sections of Coleman Drive that would also be subject to flooding. So, if you were to go with the option that does not raise the level of the parking lot, we may be going back a few years after that going, okay, now we have to raise Coleman Drive and the parking lot in order to keep them usable.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I think the same thing would be true of the whole walking path that was created a few years ago. It's a significant visitor attraction, and you think that you'd have to pay attention to that along with Coleman Beach.
Yeah.
But to your point too, I mean, it could be something where Coleman Drive gets wet, but it doesn't devastate it. So it's still, it bounces right back after that event, and people can then access that parking lot again.
Yeah, it makes a big difference whether it's. Like I say, I think there are probably a lot of details to be ironed out before one of these would be selected.
Yeah.
In that scenario, then you have to think about, what about the people who get trapped out on the parking lot? How are you going to deal with those people?
Yeah.
Helicopters.
Brilliant. Okay, the third site was the Embarcadero waterfront. Some site details there. We have about a plus 14 feet in elevation, both the fixed piers and the existing grade. Mostly protected with slope protection like riprap, bulkhead walls. Has a benefit of not being subject to ocean waves. It just has basically, you just think about still water levels essentially. So the daily tides, and then you just add a couple of feet of sea level rise, or 5.5 feet. We looked at all the different assets as underdeck utilities and gangways and all the associated supporting facilities for those. Kind of a cartoon showing this area and the different critical. This is kind of really difficult to read actually, but in the report, this has all the elevations to the assets, or typical elevations of the assets looked at relative to mean high or high water. So your average daily high tide over the 19 years, which is 5.3 feet, I believe. I can't see it from here. And then we added our sea level rise scenarios on top of that, 2 and 5.5, and also included that wonderful 10-foot scenario, just to show what that might look like. And our findings were in 2050, we had pretty minimal impacts in this reach. Note that this is, I did notice on this to the south and east, there are some fixed piers that are lower than this. So this doesn't, every site kind of needs to be looked at individually relative to these water levels, but in this reach, things look like they have minimal impact through 2100. So scenario 1 would be mostly focused on accommodation, and it could be rolled out in a number of ways, but there are all kinds of strategies to waterproof underdeck utilities and move things. Basically what goes on here is like under a house in the crawl space where all your utilities kind of come out, your sewer, water, gas, and when these things start getting wet and dry a lot, the service life drops off dramatically and things can start failing. So you want to get ahead of that. When things start getting wet and dry, that's the time to move those things. Storm drains can back up, essentially, as water levels start to approach them. Water can back up on the streets in some places. A detailed analysis would need to be looked at to see what storm drains might have this effect, but generally you can think of water eventually backing up these pipes. Floating docks and guide piles can be something that to look at. Guide piles in this area have about a plus 11 elevation at the tip. So as these floating docks get higher up on that pile, you get some weird forces that weren't really anticipated on those piles, and you can also have the docks go over top in worst case scenarios. Gangways have like a run to them, so they run out. In some spots, you might have areas where they run out into utility connections or electrical connections and different things that might cause problems. So those are things to look at as leases come in for renewal and things like that. So scenario 1 focuses on that through basically no action until leases come into the city's doors, and then they start looking at these different features. Scenario 2 is really just focused on that 10-foot scenario and these high levels of sea level rise. And it's essentially a no-action alternative until some real sea level rise starts being realized within Morro Bay, so like 6 feet or more. I should back up a little bit, though. Similar to relining a road or doing a big bridge, though, this is all going to take a significant planning effort, and not sure how to roll this thing out perfectly, but a large-scale redevelopment would make sense if that's being planned or is in the future being planned. And what we came up with for elevation was like about a 5-foot gain of grade of fixed piers come up and the existing grade to accommodate these really high levels of sea level rise. So that concludes my sea level rise adaptation discussion. We'll open up for questions.
Yeah, I may be a little just dense, but did I get the conclusion that sea level rise is not anticipated to overtop the land area along the Embarcadero during the period up to 2100?
That's right.
It's going to be mostly water-based structures that will be impacted.
Yeah. The Embarcadero is at plus 14, and with our 5.5 feet, we get to 10.5 during, so we still have that 3.5 feet during most conditions. Note that there are tides that are higher than that. Our king tides that we get 5 times or plus a year are going to be 2 feet on top of that, so that gets you to plus 12, 12 and a half, 13. So at that point you start seeing something, but it's not going to be devastating. So through 2100, everything looks pretty good for this reach. Note that on the south end, I did note that there was some fixed piers that were lower fixed piers with restaurants on top of them. So this needs to be rolled out on kind of a site-by-site basis. The city, kind of armed with these tools, will help them in that assessment.
So are you looking for recommendations or comments from us on the different scenarios at the different locations, or what actions are we looking for here, Jeff?
I'd say general feedback.
Okay.
I mean, I think this is one of the tasks that's a specific part of a scope that we've agreed to with the Coastal Commission. We're essentially going to use the information in the context of the LCP, but any of these specific improvements may or may not become a part of the LCP. I think that the most useful thing for the team at this point is just your general impressions, clarification questions, and suggestions about the information that you've received, and ideas that may lead you toward, or other types of input that would help us as we take this information, refine it, discuss it with the Coastal Commission, and then bring it back into the LCP.
One thought I had relating to one of the public comments about the flooding on Main Street right before 41. Part of that problem was not only the storm surge, but a lot of water coming down the creeks and a lot of dead trees getting caught up in the creek and blocking the bridge, so that the water was going up and over instead of going through. Mm-hmm. And I know it's a huge challenge to do anything in advance with Fish and Game. They had problems up in Cambria, Santa Rosa Creek Road, washed out this year, and they'd been trying to say, can we do something about the creek before this happens, and they wouldn't let them. But I wonder if that would be something to consider, because there's a lot of the mobile homes along that creek, a lot of lower income housing areas. It's critical areas for our community. So whether that's something to sort of right into it, that we need to have the ability and the access to keep those creeks running clear, removing dead trees that are down before the storms come.
And the same with storm drains. I think there was a problem with some of the storm drains being clogged as well.
I'm finding this a really difficult issue because of so much uncertainty in it, coupled with the fact that a lot of this adaptation is going to be extremely expensive. I know you haven't gotten to the point of trying to estimate those costs yet, but when you started to do that, then you'd probably want to look at a planning method that would evaluate them in terms of human value. How much bang do we get for our buck? So Highway 1 might be a higher priority to protect because it's a corridor we use so much, but maybe not the rock. And I don't see any discussion in here about retreat, because the rock changes to adapt the rock in the parking lots to continue current kinds of uses would be very expensive, and the benefits would be very narrow. The alternative of having intermittent flooding, that's going to disrupt everything so much anyway that is it really worth putting investment into that? I know this is, I'm raising a very touchy issue, but it seems that if we're going to be looking out at 50 or 60 or 80 years, we need to consider something like that, because we don't know when the sea level rise is going to stop, and we don't know if it's going to stop accelerating. So putting a big investment into something that has a narrow benefit may not be worth it. And I'd like to point out that the sand spit has eroded in the past to the point where there was flooding across parts of it. That was in perhaps a lower sea level. So there's so much uncertainty in that I wonder if it wouldn't be worth our while to consider some alternatives for at least that area, and possibly other areas, like it's maybe not our business, but the state park on the South Bay might have the same kind of issue. You just pull back.
Well, I wonder too if we should, particularly in areas that are used heavily for tourism, if we should be considering some kind of seasonal issues. For example, the Morrow Strand campground, or certain things could be perhaps closed in the winter or not used as much, but definitely in the summer when you have the more intensive uses, then really focusing some of the, some of these solutions, you're just going to, you put more sand there, then the sand is there. But you could have, I guess what I'm, maybe I want to call it a partial retreat of some kind, where some times of the year, when they're not heavily used anyway, and when that is storm season, maybe then you might choose not to do so much mitigation there, but you simply just going to use it less during those times of the year, close it at certain times, and then focus on maintaining the uses in the summer when the usage normally is greater for those facilities.
I think, too, we ought to consider now using, as you said, the asset of those sands from the dredging. It is kind of just thrown down the coast. And if it's going to be that valuable, and it's happening every year now that we are dredging, boy, to be pumping it up the coast somehow. I remember one year when it was going out on the beach in those big pipes. Maybe that just should be part of what we do, whether that goes to Harbor Advisory Board for their discussion or what, but it seems like an asset we're letting go down the.
I would agree with Glenn Silloway's comments about cost. These are all good things to do, and I think we probably all love to protect everything, but I guess as a consultant, I would be looking to you guys to make recommendations considering the financial condition of the city, and we're not Carmel, we're not Malibu. What would be reasonable recommendations for us to do? I'm all about retreat because I think it's probably the most affordable options in most cases, but I also want our critical infrastructure protected in a way that Coastal Commission will be happy with it. And as I mentioned before, I do think we need to address the low-lying residential areas so we can at least tell them when to pack their bags or tell them something.
I'd like to, I would like to see some kind of discussion of, it's one thing to talk about public facilities and public funding of public facilities. You've got this sort of sensitive area where you may have protection of residents, which is a public good, but it's private land, and how does that work, or how is that going to work, and how should those things be funded? Is it different? How is it different? And maybe some discussion of those trade-offs, or how would be, I think, be a good idea.
One other question I had was, what would be your recommendation in terms of how many? Should we look at this every 10 years, or what are other cities doing in terms of watching sea level rise to update their reports, or what they need to do?
Well, you guys are kind of on the bleeding edge with the rest of a handful of other cities, so you're kind of right there with everybody else that's entering this process. So I think that setting metrics, these triggers that we talked about earlier, and keeping an eye on those, whatever that might be, whether it's flooding or minimum beach widths or roadway closures, things or maintenance costs escalating, things like that for Morrow Rock Park example. Mm-hmm. Are things that I think should be set up.
I like the idea of minimum beach widths, because that even would help those residential areas. And again, if you're enhancing the dunes and throwing sand back on the beach, that should be helping at some level to protect cloisters a little bit. So again, if that's allowed by Coastal Commission to do further up the coast and near the rock, then they should be allowing a similar activity in between.
Some sort of metric, cloisters, this is not my area of expertise, obviously, but it seems to me that cloisters is largely protected by the dune area there.
Yeah.
So if the dune area if the width of that starts to sink, I think that's a warning.
Yeah.
The other thing, and this kind of echoes what other people have said, is I think a real factor to be considered has to be, particularly with regard to intermittent flooding, storm surge flooding, has to be the economic consequences of that, okay? For example, you have a parking lot at Morrow Rock and it's under 18 inches of water for a day and then it drains off, no biggie. But if you have high-end restaurants and hotels along the Embarcadero that have 18 inches of water in them for 24 hours, you have a major economic hit to the city, or houses in the cloisters. So I think one of the things, I think we in some way need to also prioritize protection of those structures which would suffer the most from being underwater. And the other thing I'd like to bring up in terms of perhaps vertical retreat of structures, and this may be totally inapplicable, I don't know, but in other areas of the country where the problem is not, daily wave action, but storm surges, they simply use pilings to raise the height of structures rather than trying to raise the entire level of the ground. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. So is that a feasible alternative for vertical retreat, say, along the Embarcadero?
Yeah, I think that could be. The caveat is if we see 10 feet, then the grade will be wet too. So that's during certain portions of the day. So it depends on what sea level rise scenario we're looking at. I think certainly that strategy would buy us a lot of time. Yeah.
I just want to chime in and say I think I really agree with the comment about ongoing study, or just prioritizing this as an ongoing study, because I feel like the only thing we might be able to say about climate science is that it's changing, right? And that we know effects cascade, and we're seeing that. So this is a moment in time to me. This is interesting, but it's not in any way a comprehensive picture, and I don't know if it's going to stay the reality or we don't know for how long. So if we can encourage ourselves in the documents to prioritize continuing to look at this, I think that's a great thing.
And I would like to, I think Jeff made this point earlier, but given the importance of the machinery that we're going to have in the floodplain along Morrow Creek, we should be looking at that in terms of sea level rise and how fast those dunes in front of it might erode. There's stuff that would protect that area, but I would like to know for sure that we're thinking about it, because there's infrastructure in there that's going to be really hard to replace, and if anything goes wrong, it's going to be really damaging.
The other thought I had that might be useful at the end of all of what we've just talked about is I think it might be a good idea to start an accumulation fund now for possible sea level rise things that will come up, instead of being surprised and then scrambling to figure out how we're going to pay for it all. So obviously it's difficult to predict how quickly things will happen or if they'll happen at all, but if you could put some number with your final recommendations, I think that would be helpful.
I guess Amy pointed out that there are the economics of these different options are laid out in the document. They are in the table. They're in a large matrix, so that might be why some people missed it. But each different section has a matrix. At the very bottom of that, there's the cost of that option with initial cost and life cycle cost. Again, rough order of magnitude costs for these options.
Yeah, I was hoping maybe you'd put that together for us once we decide on how we're going to handle each area.
Yeah, we understand how that's a big part of the decision, certainly.
Well, thank you very much. This gives us all a lot to think about.
You're welcome.
A lot to scratch our head over, more than anything else. And we'll look forward to see how this moves forward.
Okay, and Amy's going to do the next part of our presentation, which is about the draft land use map, and the accompanying designations.
Okay, thank you. So first I would encourage everyone to have your version of this available, because as you know from our past meetings and looking up here, it's going to be hard to look at the details just looking at the slides, and I'm going to be scrolling past the map. We can come back to it when we need to up on the screen. So this is a more fleshed out version of both the proposed land use map of land use designations, as well as the table that goes with it that you have, and that includes any new designations, any designations that we're proposing to be taken out of the land use element and off of the map, as well as some revisions. And I'm going to go through all of those. So to start with, this slide has both base designations and then overlays that we're proposing to remove. And to start with, there is currently the medium density residential / neighborhood commercial designation. And we are proposing to retain each of those individually, but no longer have that joint designation. We also are taking away the service commercial. So anything that is currently designated service commercial will have a new designation. And a lot of the area that's designated service commercial would become district commercial. And I'll get into that a little bit more on a later slide. We also are proposing to delete the mariculture and marine research designation. And that is primarily because we feel that it can be folded into other existing designations. And then I think we discussed this the last time we talked about this list, but just to go over again, the overlays, we basically are doing away with the concept of using overlays in the general plan, except for one new overlay that we're proposing. So that would remove the planned development, restricted areas, park, school, public / institutional, and then the interim / open space uses in industrial categories, overlays. And all of those types of development would be addressed somewhere else. Specifically, the public institutional would actually become a base designation. And everything else would either function under a different land use designation or within a zone that would implement a more broad land use designation. So then we have several slides on what are we actually proposing moving forward, what is staying in, basically, and what is new. And on each of the following slides, anything that's shown in blue italics is new or revised. And I'll just say also up front that the table that you have has much more detail than what's on the slides. And so I'm going to try to go relatively quickly through the slides, and then we can talk about individual classifications if you would like. I think that's going to be a little more useful for getting you information that you're not seeing up here. So one thing that we did do across the board is we added floor area ratio for all commercial and industrial land uses. That's something that doesn't exist in your general plan now, and it does exist in most general plans. It does exist in the zoning. And we also added a density range for mixed use. We have it in there already for residential, but then we have a density that's allowed for residential units in there for mixed use zones that allow, mixed use designations that allow residential.
Can I ask how you determine the floor area ratios? Are you going to go through that?
We can talk about that. It was a process where we looked at what was in your existing zoning. So where we show on the table the zoning districts that correspond to the land uses, we looked at all of those zoning districts if there was more than one that corresponded and what's in place now. We also analyzed your actual development on the ground and looked at what the on the ground floor area ratio is. So looking at we didn't do every single parcel, but we did do a pretty exhaustive characterization of each designation, whether most of the development is 1-story, 2-story, and then what amount of the lot is actually developed currently.
Okay, so did you take the average of what's there? Did you look at different averages in different, like some parts of the city have very small lots and their floor area ratios are probably higher and maybe should be higher. And some areas have larger lots and you'd expect those to be smaller. And then even when you looked at those, if you looked at those separately, did you take the high range, the low range, middle? What did you do with that information?
Yeah, so the actual on-the-ground analysis is the average. And then we also looked at other comparable jurisdictions where we could find that information and what they have in place. And then we also thought about, when we had all of those numbers put together, we thought about, well, how much more potential development might occur, and we came up with a number that would factor that into the equation.
So you took the averages and made them, turn them into maximums? Is that...
Do you want to?
Okay, and I have a reason for asking these questions, but go ahead.
But yes, they are all maximums, what we're proposing.
Okay, but you took the averages from what you found and you turned them into maximums. They're characterized here as the maximums.
We took the averages.
Yes.
Then from there, we're thinking about, okay, first off, what is the future development character of these areas likely to be? And is it essentially similar to existing conditions, or are these designations and or areas where a certain change might be entertained? In that case, you're seeing the maximum. For example, if there were an area that, this is theoretical, if there were an area that's predominantly 1-story that you're looking to potentially convert to a mix of 1-story and 2-story, you would go from your existing FAR and encourage a maximum that would be slightly higher, so that you can accommodate that second story.
It would be quite a bit higher if you're going from 1 to 2 stories, I would think. Okay.
Right.
So did you look at, for example, say the North Morrow versus the Heights versus, in different areas where there probably are very big differences in the floor area ratios? How did you look at that?
Right. We did consider that. That's obviously reflective in the average, but that's also something that can vary and would vary by location, either in the general plan or in the zoning or both. There's a lot of cases here where the general plan is laying out essentially what is the range, what is the intent, what is the maximum lot coverage that you could have in a designation citywide. The zoning applicable to different locations in the city may entertain a maximum that is equivalent to what the general plan says, or for example, if the character of that area is lower intensity, the zoning may carry a maximum FAR that's lower than what the general plan is providing.
Okay, I'm concerned because I know we have some public comment on this. If we're concerned about affordability, there's definitely that tension there between how dense you are and how affordable you are. Okay, and there are, as I said, there are already large differences. The lot sizes are half the size in North Morrow than they are in, say, the Heights. Okay, and so I'm wondering how I'm a little concerned how did you treat empty lots when you looked at that? Did you assume they were zero, or were they
just
excluded?
To clarify, this doesn't apply to residential properties.
That's
correct?
one good clarification. We also did not count vacant lots in the average.
Okay. Okay, so the vacant lots were excluded and not assumed to be zero. Okay, that's important to note, because we do have some areas
Correct.
where we want to have infill, and if you're going to set that lower, then that would limit the uses for those areas. I agree, it's not residential. So the affordability maybe is not as much of an emphasis as I was looking at. Okay, let me stop asking so many questions and let you finish this, but I may have a few more when we get down to it, only because the economic development and potential here, if we want to have, household level job or head of household jobs and things, really may be limited by this, and that's why I'm asking the questions. So.
Okay. But while we're on this, why was it decided to exclude residential properties from FAR?
It's
I mean, there has been considerable interest among the community in doing FAR or some other mechanism to quantify the size, bulk, scale consistency that the current general plan requires. So how was it decided that that would not be here?
I'm going to characterize it that it is generally typical to use floor area ratios to describe non-residential development in the context of a general plan, and to use density or units per acre to describe essentially the intensity of residential development at a general plan scale. That's not to say that zoning couldn't introduce further measures regarding bulk scale size.
And there are a number of communities that use FAR with regard to residential development. I mean, it's not, certainly not unheard of or terribly unusual.
No, it's not unusual, correct, but it is typical practice to consider one for non-residential and the other for residential.
But we can use height, coverage, lot size, and setbacks to get us to similar results that FAR get us to.
Correct.
I mean, there are other measures that we can use.
There are a number of different ways to do it.
Yeah.
Right.
Absolutely.
And we've had these conversations. RRM's doing the zoning code portion of the update, correct? So we've had, and Martha Miller's the lead on that, and we have had conversations with her about those types of things. And so, again, the idea was that those conversations would take place in the context of the zoning code update. Correct.
But in terms of the land uses, the table that you guys included at the end of the packet talks about proposed max lot coverage / FAR. And there's no slashes in the table. So I'm just wondering
And that's a very good question, and the reason we said that is because the only terms that are used in the current city documents are maximum lot coverage. So we just wanted to make it clear that that is what we're talking about. But moving forward, if FAR is the term that's chosen, that's what it would be. So there is no FAR in the general plan, and there is maximum lot coverage in the zoning for some of the districts. That's how it's termed.
Okay, but when you're saying proposed, you're proposing FARs, right?
Correct,
That's
yeah.
what's in the table, you're proposing FARs.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks.
Okay.
I just have one more question. I'm sorry, on the mixed land use category, where you do have an FAR, but mixed means residential, commercial, right? That's what you're talking about.
Yes.
And so if you have a maximum FAR, you're limiting both, right? Is that
the intent was to limit the commercial to the FAR, and then the density would dictate the residential part of the development.
Okay.
In the context of a mixed-use designation, it would also potentially be appropriate to say accommodate the commercial and the residential within the envelope of the total. So you could say this is the residential density that we're striving for in these projects, and the residential and commercial components need to be contained in the envelope of the FAR.
Well, that wasn't. I'm sorry. That wasn't just what Amy said. I thought she said the actual opposite.
She
okay.
did. She did, and that's what's proposed here now.
Okay.
I'm suggesting that if there were a desire on the part of the GPAC, that would be a valid suggestion for change.
Okay. So, Amy, what you're talking about is in the FA, the one category you've got is on the mixed here. You would have the 0.6, I think it was. Yeah, it's on the. I know we're jumping around. I'm sorry, but. You've got a maximum FAR of 0.6, so that would apply to the commercial part, and then the density of the units per acre, that would be in addition to that, or would still be, but you're proposing it would be in addition to that.
Correct.
Right.
Okay. All right, I'm going to think about that a little. Thanks.
Okay, so for the residential land use designations, we are not proposing any changes to density. So these are your current densities in your general plan for low through high density. We are proposing some changes to the descriptions that are in your table. So primarily to clarify some of the existing descriptions are extremely limited, and there are other uses that are allowed in some of those designations. For example, group housing uses are allowed across most, or I believe all of the residential uses. So that's the change that we're proposing there.
Could I comment on that?
And I wanted to ask a question about that too, yeah.
So the medium and the high density, I know we've had a lot of discussion about wanting more multifamily units, fewer single-family houses being built on R2 lots, et cetera. I see medium and high density both include single-family construction options, and I'm wondering if that's really what we want to do there. I'm not so sure that it is.
So that reflects what's currently allowed, but that's a good comment.
Melanie?
Yeah, I mean, I think just, I hadn't thought about that point, that both included single-family homes. It's a fraught topic in some jurisdictions. Certainly small lot, single-family development is something that's happening, a lot, and I think can be really great and really great infill options, and it can also be really abused if it's not, very carefully guided. So, I wouldn't personally rule it out, but I would really want to think about how it could manifest. And I was going to ask something that I'm sure I'm not the first person to ever ask, and I just can't help myself. Has there been discussion about the fact that we have these designations that say low and moderate? I just don't. I have never seen R1 characterized as moderate, and an RA characterized as low and suburban. And so I'm looking both, as you can tell, at general plan and zoning, and their consistency or lack thereof. But to me, it's very low and low. It's certainly not low and moderate in those at those density ranges. And so I was really confused when trying to look at the map, look at the colors, look at the nomenclature. It didn't make any sense to me. So I don't know what the history is, or if we're hugely wedded to those terms, but it just we probably are hugely wedded to those terms, but had to point it out.
I had another, so maybe it's a related question, but there are a lot of places that are R1 where there's 2 and sometimes 3 dwelling lots on the same unit or on the same parcel. And I know some of them are granny units or whatever, but there doesn't seem to be much in the way of regulation as are they really family members or what happens to them. What are the rules about that kind of thing?
About second units or
about second or sometimes third units on R1 lots. How is that? How's that done?
Three units wouldn't be allowed on an R1 lot, typically. So they'd be existing non-conforming situations. We do allow secondary dwelling units consistent with state law. We've been chasing our secondary dwelling unit ordinance for years now. We seem to get it through the process and then send it up to coastal, and then they just recently changed it again, so we had to take it back, and we're going to update it again through this update process. But the current ordinance that we have in place is inconsistent in many ways with state law, but it does still have a parameter that you have one of them occupied by the owner and the other one is deed restricted. It can't be sold separately or that type of thing. So
it can be rented.
It can be rented. Yeah, the idea is that it provides housing opportunities for folks. Yeah. Yeah.
So Scott, while you were gone, I had a question about the medium and high density designations, in that considering the need that we have, I think, for multifamily properties and not more single-family homes. I was questioning why single-family homes is considered an option in both of those densities, as opposed to just the R1, the moderate density.
I can provide some clarification to that. So that was LCP amendment we did in 2014, and it's really reflective of the fact that, especially in North Morro Bay, we have really small, high-density land use lots that really could not meet the density to provide multifamily housing. So you might have a 3,000, 4,000 square foot lot. You really could only provide a single-family home, even though it's high density.
So this would apply to those lots specifically based on the
right. Yes, and that's the description where it says
density of the maximum lot coverage.
Yeah, and so basically, such a size or topography would preclude multifamily development. So it's really, if you have no other development option, then you would be allowed to do a single family home with a minor use permit.
With a what kind of permit?
It's a minor use permit.
Minor use permit, okay, thanks.
It requires justification
Okay. So we're moving into commercial, and a lot of these have their own slide because there's a little more information. This one's not a lot, but we are proposing a new name called Community Commercial. This is in the area that currently is occupied mostly by general office and district commercial in the downtown. So we do have a proposed description in there. There are some other, things in there. I believe there's probably some mixed use that occurs where this is being proposed. Currently, it is mixed use. So based on working with the community and the city and working with RRM on what they're seeing in terms of the zoning, we felt like it made sense to have a designation that really focused in the downtown and what the community is looking for in that area versus some of the other commercial areas of the city. And I'll
So I have
pause.
a question about that. Looking at residential uses allowed both above and behind commercial uses with discretionary approval in both the community commercial and district commercial categories. And I don't know whether it would belong here or in zoning, but should we have some caveat that you don't lose commercial space to residential? Because there are some proposals right now that would remove probably half in one of the buildings and at least a third in the other of commercial space where an owner wants to do a residence that's behind those buildings on the ground level, but he's sort of taking away from the commercial property. So given that, I know we have big housing issues in town, but we also have commercial property issues where we don't have enough spaces for businesses to be in. So is that something, I mean, is there a priority in that kind of district that we maintain the commercial space, or is that not going to be a priority?
I think the priority is actually that we have real usable commercial space and not token space with residential above it. We want real commercial store, especially in the downtown. You want real commercial storefronts that that are active and people can see into, and nice windows in front of them, and those types of things. It's one of the things we sort of lack in many areas, and it's one of the things that would provide the connection, say, between the downtown and the waterfront. We have that sort of two, like on Morro Bay Boulevard, a couple of blocks of just dead area where some hotels are and vacant properties and so forth. So I think the idea is that you have real storefronts, and then if you give us the real commercial, then we'll consider the other piece. Is sort of the idea behind this.
So then there would be something in place that would not allow a property owner to take away from existing commercial to turn it into residential.
I don't know that we've gotten to that point yet, no.
Okay.
I would think that'd be sort of an individual thing where maybe if they would enhance the space, that maybe you could actually be somewhat smaller, or if you could, I think that it's almost something you'd have to look at on a case by case basis. I know there is a fair amount of vacant property, and so if someone was offering an upgraded space, maybe they would be allowed to.
I'm
do
thinking of
something
a
else with
property
it,
that's actually a real going proposition. One of the probably fastest growing and most successful businesses on Morro Bay Boulevard right now, but the owner is looking at taking the back part of her business away, which means she would leave because she needs that space to be able to do her business. So it's kind of like taking your garage and your closet and your bathroom out of your house and saying, okay, but you can have the rest of it. And it wouldn't work. So just curious. I mean,
I think
up above, that would be great. Build an apartment upstairs. But
I think with this sort of thing, folks, the devil is in the details. You know what I'm saying? In other words, you may say that residential is permitted in association with the commercial use, but the question is how much, what percentage, where, that sort of thing.
And those things are probably answered more specifically in the zoning code than in the general plan. I mean, Yeah, we're, as you said, details, and that's where the details are located, yeah. So.
But the question I have on this, Amy, is the community commercial appears to be the designation down most of Morro Bay Boulevard and a good portion of Main Street, okay? There seems to be a growing consensus that on-site parking is not appropriate in that area, with the exception of certain uses that require it, such as hotels, for example. But a maximum FAR of 0.9 sort of precludes full use of the lot with a two-story building. You'd need a 1.8, and we're talking about a maximum height level of 37 feet. So if you're actually going to get to 3 stories with a full utilization of the lot, you're talking about a much higher FAR. So this doesn't exactly fit with sort of the other currents of change that are happening.
That was sort of where I was going with the other questions, is if you're going to allow the intensive use of these kind of lots, you do have to go, it's not that you can't have an FAR, but it does have to be more than, if you're going to try and go to 2 stories, as you were saying, Jeff, you do have to allow that. I mean, if you're going to go 3 stories and 37 feet, would you have to go underground, I guess, for part of it? I don't know, for some of them. It just, it seems odd. And this doesn't seem reflective of that more intensive use that you might want to allow infill development and other things and make that economic.
Yeah, those are really good comments. And one thing that was somewhat across the board on the actual on-the-ground analysis is it was generally much lower than what's allowed now. So,
I'm sorry?
So when we actually analyzed the intensity that is on the ground now, it was almost in every designation much lower than what's existing or proposed in this table.
But that's true. But Amy, a good part of that has to do with the on-site parking requirements that have been in
We
place.
understand that's not necessarily reflective of the vision or where we want to be moving forward, but we are balancing all of those things in terms of what's realistic moving forward. But we're not saying no. Just didn't have that information in the table, so I thought that would be interesting to share. Okay. So the district commercial, which is one of your existing names, would now be applied to slightly different areas. And this is, if you can read your definition, more similar now in terms of the description to what the service commercial was previously. And it does have a maximum FAR proposed, like all of the other commercial. You can see this is, let me back up to the map. So this would be applied in several places along the highway in quite a few places, on the Tri-W site, maintaining the commercial requirement on that property. But now there is a distinction between this dark red or bright red and then other commercial, the community commercial that we just talked about, the neighborhood commercial, which is applied in North Morro Bay, and other types of commercial that are more specific, like the fishing area.
Could you explain the proposal to lower the density or the FAR for those for that designation?
Yeah, this was based on the ground information, and this is more of an auto-oriented, generally type of use. So this is not where we're envisioning that infill type of scenario that we were just discussing.
Those are places along Quintana that have really large parking lots. So I'm assuming that relates to, you've got, Albertsons and Rite Aid, but there's a large area that's parking lots that service those. businesses.
Right, so district commercial previously applied in different areas, including in the downtown. So it's being applied to a pretty different geographic area than it is in the existing map.
I understand what you just said, but I don't understand why that means you would lower the density. Just because the things that are there have lower density, you would lower the maximum allowed density?
That's one reason, but the other reason that maybe isn't, I'm not explaining that well, is that this designation was applied in the downtown particularly, which is an area where we do have more of a vision for greater intensity. And now it is no longer applying in that area. So the types of, the character of the areas where it is proposed to apply is less intense. And again, this is definitely up for comment, but that's why we did it that way.
Well, I think generally the long-term plan is to maintain these as sort of auto-oriented. You drive there, you get what you need, and the cost of land has not reached the point where two-story development is typically warranted at this point.
We definitely felt like the feedback we've gotten so far, especially when we focused on certain opportunity sites in those areas, was that people don't really envision those as the most walkable or mixed-use areas. Okay, we are going to move on to the next designation, which is the neighborhood commercial. And we got a lot of really good feedback on this designation. This applies on North Main on the right-hand side in North Morro Bay. So a couple things have changed since the last time we talked to you about this designation. One is that instead of having more than one designation along that corridor, what we're proposing is to have everything along the street be neighborhood commercial, but some of the parcels have an overlay on them, and we're calling this the mixed-use residential overlay, and that allows more residential development to occur, and that reflects a lot of the feedback we heard that doesn't sound like it makes sense to try to drive commercial on every single parcel along that area, and that there are certain areas that are already commercial, and then there are some that are all residential. So I'm not sure how easy it will be to see on the map, but you can look in your
That's
packets.
what I was going to ask. I can't see it on the map. So I know where it should be, but I'm not seeing it. So it's North Morro, east of the highway.
So it's a pink
really
color,
showing.
and then it has hatching on it where that overlay is
I can't see
applied.
the hatching at all in the printout. But so you're saying, is it the whole corridor that where we have the neighborhood commercial? Is it all there?
No, it's not.
Just part of it.
And I
Okay.
apologize that
I
it's
just
really
can't
hard to
see it, but
see
yeah.
at this level.
Yeah. Okay.
I think it might be this stuff up here.
So Amy, is that basically saying that houses can continue to be built resident on those lots
Yeah,
or
so
commercial?
let me read the description for this one, because I think
I guess
this is a new concept. So let's see. Where is it? Here we go. So this would be the areas that allow residential uses in addition to the base allowed uses. So the neighborhood commercial, though, does allow some residential, but it's only above and behind, I believe. So this would allow it anywhere on the parcel. And it would be at that higher density range. That's what's being proposed. And this overlay actually can be applied not just in the neighborhood commercial, it could be applied anywhere. Right now we're proposing it both on top of neighborhood commercial as well as on top of visitor serving commercial. So we'll get to that shortly.
So I know you were trying to get rid of overlays, which I think is fantastic. Why did you think this one was important?
Well, it was the result of a lot of discussion, and including with Martha, who's preparing the zoning. And one of the things that we kept coming back to is trying to simplify the downtown area, in particular downtown and waterfront. And if you look at the existing map in the waterfront, there are at least three designations that hopscotch in that area. And we arrived at this proposal to try to simplify for the most part.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
Just to say everything out loud, though, the waterfront commercial industrial is hatched. This is, again, my context must be really bad right now. But that's hatched. But again, that's its own designation. It's just a hatched designation, right? We're not saying that the residential, right?
That's correct.
Overlay doesn't.
It's to represent a mix of commercial and industrial.
Yep.
And we are very open to comments on the colors and the patterns.
And it remains apparent that we're going to need to do some zooming on this map when it's presented in the document.
Right.
Yes, you have some very large parcels and some very small parcels. It's challenging to present in this context. So, moving on. So, the visitor serving commercial, another very interesting one. So, what we are proposing is to actually expand your amount of visitor serving commercial. We did the analysis, and it's quite a bit, a larger number of acreage. Of course, some of that has to do with the Dynegy site. But there are other areas too that would be included, and in order to accommodate what's allowed on some of those parcels now, which are a lot of them are designated mixed use, we would apply this mixed use residential overlay. And I believe we increased the FAR for this one. Yeah, and this is based on a lot of feedback that this is an area where we want more activity, and we want, we did the downtown waterfront strategic plan and identified a lot of opportunities in this area of town where the visitor serving commercial is. Of course, that said, it is applied in quite a few places, and not just in the downtown, and well, not just in the waterfront, but that is a large amount of it. And then we do have it applied to the existing wastewater treatment plant site, which, if and when that site changes use, that's another area that could happen.
I assume, Amy, that there will be specific provisions that will override the FAR. For example, if you want to put in a single-story hotel, or motel, and we require X amount of on-site parking for overnight accommodations, that you may not be able to get your 1.0 FAR, and that's fine.
So you're bringing up a point that we're going to talk about with the mixed-use designation, but it comes up on a variety of designations, and that is the question of requiring a certain FAR or requiring certain uses to get the kind of development that we are looking for, but then also that has to work with the standards. So that came up in our discussions, and we don't have the answer yet because the zoning is not finished, but we are looking for your input on that. So I think that's a good segue to the mixed use, which I think might be next. Basically, we're not proposing any change to the commercial recreational fishing designation. We are proposing an FAR, which is exactly the same as what is in the zoning for that district. And I'm going to jump to the mixed use and then come back because that ties in. So here's the mixed use without any additional tag-ons, just the mixed use designation. So what the description says, and this is new, is any combination of commercial and all these other uses. I'm not going to read all of them. It could occur in vertical or horizontal orientation, and mixed-use development is required within the constraints of parcel size, context / adjacent uses, and access to transportation. So we added that last sentence in recognition that there are going to be times when it's just not possible. And so that applies to both mixed-use being a requirement, and then also the FAR. So we do want to land on the correct FARs, as we've said already, and we may not be there yet, but we understand there's more to be worked out in the zoning in terms of the actual development standards and making this work.
So is the FAR, you're proposing at the lower end of what's currently allowed, but that's because the residential would be in addition to that, right? Okay. All right, thanks.
Mm-hmm. And can I go back and ask a basic question? Why are we putting FAR in the land use categories as opposed to in the zoning categories? Because it seems to me that there's more flexibility if it's put into the zoning category. For example, let's say there end up being 3 different zoning categories that correspond to the mixed-use land use category. It may be appropriate to have different FARs for each one of those.
And it may, and again, kind of to the earlier point, the general plan might set an FAR maximum. That FAR maximum may be implemented by multiple zones, each of which have a different level. So that the zone, the general plan may allow this maximum, the zone may restrict it to a certain level based on the characteristics of the surrounding area.
Or in fact, it could be a range. There could be a maximum and a minimum.
Correct.
Which is what your zoning has currently in many of the districts.
Right. And one of to answer the question about the sort of why the FAR in the general plan to begin with, one of the requirements we have to meet under state law with regard to the land use element is to provide a measure of physical intensity that goes with each land use designation. That's actually a deficiency of the existing general plan. So that's one of the things we're trying to rectify with that.
Okay, we are getting close to the end here, so I want to get through everything. So coming back to the industrial, we have your general light industrial and your coastal dependent industrial. We are proposing, actually we're not proposing changes to the descriptions for those. We are proposing FARs, and those are shown here. One thing to note is that you only have one parcel designated coastal dependent industrial in the proposed land use map, and that is in the Chevron properties. So that's something to consider as we move forward. And I should say this is a good time to mention that we're not discussing the study areas today in terms of the proposed changes. We were waiting for a council to give their feedback last week, and so that's happened now, and we'll be folding that into the next version of the map. But depending on how things play out in the next, while we're finishing up the draft plan, we can consider whether it makes sense to leave the coastal dependent industrial on that parcel.
Amy, these are about half of what the current FARs are for these categories. Can you discuss that?
Yeah, so this was really based on what's on the ground, and especially for the coastal dependent, with there being only one parcel, I think it was 0.9 was the existing, and it didn't seem to make sense at all for that type of use.
And that would be highly uncharacteristic of an industrial use. Most industrial uses have much lower FARs than 0.9.
Okay, I'm assuming. So do we not want to see more of this, or I'm not sure understanding why. So you're saying it's currently 0.5 for what's out there, and that's why you're going to limit it to that?
That's one reason. We also looked at comparable jurisdictions and what their more modern, updated plans have in them. And like Jeff said, it's just, most industrial uses have a good amount of parking lot and other area that is not intensified.
Right.
Okay.
So I did already describe the proposed mixed-use residential overlay, and actually have NA here. So it would apply, the base FAR or intensity would apply. So I said that incorrectly a minute ago.
Where does the oyster farm fit in? Since you've removed the mariculture marine research.
It is actually, good question. So I believe it's in the commercial recreational fishing area, and there were, I believe, 2 or 3 parcels in that area that were designated coastal dependent industrial, and we're proposing that those be commercial recreational fishing.
Okay.
Yeah.
Amy, forgive me if this is answered elsewhere, but with regard to the general light industrial zone, my concern is the area between the Main Street Highway 1 underpass and Highway 46. That's an area that seems to be in the process of defining itself. There's quite a bit of retail in that area. There's more industrial that's back from Main Street. There's even a new hotel that's proposed, I think, in that area. So does that have the flexibility to allow that defining process to continue?
I think it's a good question. I know we've talked about this in earlier discussions because that was one of our opportunity sites. So what's recommended here is what came out of the GPAC, the Planning Commission, and the Council discussions of that site. But I think you make a valid point.
I think it's choosing its own direction, and we just don't know what that is yet,
So I think we tried to redesignate that site. That's that site on the south side of Highway 41 to have a mix of what might happen there. But you're right; it's really hard to know what will actually occur. And so I don't know if Scott or Cindy, if you want to. I know you weighed in, and when we've talked about this before on that as well. But that's what I'm remembering. Why we are where we are on this draft today.
No, I think that's true. I mean, when the council looked at this too, they thought it was appropriate when we were looking at the land use and the sort of configurations of them in this area. They did want to, allow for us to have some of that general light industrial land. They thought we need areas for those uses. These seemed appropriate to them in the conversation that we had with them. It wasn't a long conversation, I'll say that.
Yeah, we may need to revisit that, at least with the properties that front on Main Street. The ones that are back on the side streets, it may be more appropriate to say industrial.
I think that's a great comment, particularly when we've seen what can happen on those sites, that they can be storage for heavy equipment that has a fence around it, on like a major corner, on Main Street. So I think that's a great comment. You guys had commented a second ago that we weren't reflecting changes in the all the opportunity areas on this map, and I just want the ones that are outside the city limits, and I just want to comment that the way this has been mapped, it really looks like we are. So I would be really cautious about that because I feel like there are some uses that are outside the current city limits that we're designating, I think, anticipating future city use. And then there's others they look entirely different, and I think someone could think, oh my God, they're redesignating this enormous swath of land outside the city boundaries that we're not doing that.
So I should clarify that what's reflected here is everything except for the proposed SOI, which is not on there, from the previous version that we took to the Planning Commission and Council at the end of March. So the 4 study areas do have that agricultural designation on them that we discussed then. But since then, there has been comment from the Planning Commission and the Council, in particular on Study Area 1, and that will be reflected moving forward.
Yeah, just choosing a different color for what I think is the agricultural zoning just looks suddenly like, wow, I should look at this. This is different, and it's not. So,
good comment. Okay, so we have proposed a new name for an existing designation. This is the existing mixed uses harbor, and we wanted to make it clear that this is not a designation that allows residential. So we're proposing the name waterfront commercial / industrial. Very open to comments on that. One reason we did that is because this is corresponding to the waterfront zoning district. And this is the area along the Embarcadero that is the State Tidelands Trust land. And we are also proposing an FAR here, which didn't exist before. And I believe it is higher than the existing zoning FAR in that area.
1.01.
Again, I think that FAR is going to prove to be way too low. I think the vision there is to have fairly dense private spaces with a lot of public spaces. So in order to accommodate that, I think the FAR is going to have to be higher.
Okay. And we already spoke about the general mixed-use designation. The other proposed designations would be golf course, which is currently unmapped, but is in your LCP now. And we're proposing to map the golf course on the state park area. And then also the harbor navigational ways, and that is basically applies to water, and you can see that on your existing map as well. We also have, sorry, go ahead.
Just out of curiosity, what's the utility of having golf course as a separate category from open space recreation?
We've heard in the feedback so far that was preferred, but we don't think it's absolutely necessary.
Well, what does it accomplish? That's the question.
I believe when we talked about it before, it was because it's because of the state ownership. Other than that,
then maybe
I think the answer is it doesn't accomplish much. If you wrap the definition that it includes that into open space recreation, you're probably done.
Yeah, I commented on that months ago. Yeah, it just doesn't make any sense to me.
This may be a weird question, but with the harbor navigational ways, if somebody had, I think there's a proposal out there for some floating hotel rooms. Is that
not there?
Not okay. Not what is that?
That's definitely not allowed now.
Okay.
There's no residential allowed or accommodations allowed in that designation. I believe it's purely waterways and then some equipment that is associated with that is what's allowed.
But what about liveaboards?
When I looked at other jurisdictions, for example, City of Eureka, they have some of this as well. So it's not just Morro Bay. It's a coastal thing, I guess.
Water designation.
Mm-hmm.
You mean they have
floating
houses?
Land use on water, just like Morro Bay does. Okay.
I have a comment about mixed use, if we could go back to that for a minute. If you look at the map and follow Main Street down to the south part of town, there's a big swath, as you kind of right there, if you see it, Cerrito Peak, if you know where that is, the circle there, of what appears to be mixed use west of Main Street down to the water.
Yes.
You see where I'm looking?
That is, I believe it's called Mixed Use Area G currently.
Okay.
And it actually has a lot of split designation and zoning on it. So it does allow mixed use. It also allows, most of those parcels allow residential. So I'm sure you're familiar with what is actually there. It doesn't look like a mixed use area.
Yeah, I mean, my thought is that it's surrounded by a residential neighborhood and it should be residential only. I'm not so sure that folks that live down there really want commercial properties there. I don't know. I know that I don't. It seems like it's a residential neighborhood and the focus of commercial property should be in the center of town as opposed to down there, which will create a lot of traffic issues, which is already bad. And I'm just not sure that the folks down there want that at all.
Isn't there already some kind of big, large warehouse type building and some
the old
boat
cannery.
repair or some kind of thing?
Yeah, there's a
already
boatyard
some of that down there.
There's a boatyard there, and there's an old cannery and stuff like that. But it seems to me it's more appropriate to put medium or high density or even moderate density land use there as opposed to anything that allows commercial. Let me look at this mixed use again. So mixed use is any combination of commercial uses, offices, single-family housing, multifamily live-work units, institutional, cultural facilities, visitor serving uses. I mean, it's really wide open, and I just think that's a mistake that land use be applied to that area.
Where's that, Jeff?
Where the cannery is, and Bob, can you see that?
Near the inn at Morro Bay.
Yeah. And the yard, the boat yard is down there, and there's some really nice houses being built down there now, which I think is what the neighborhood likes. I just don't see that as a good place for commercial uses, except maybe a conditional use permit for the boat yard or something.
I mean, it's in the zoning side of it that those properties, as I think Amy indicated, are split.
Mm-hmm. So what does that mean?
They're split, meaning the residential portion of it is like about halfway through them. The portion that's towards Maine is a residential designation, and the portion below that, kind of below the bluff, is where the commercial waterfront uses can go, and there are some there. So, I mean, so while mixed use is a category that is one of the categories that we have that those uses that are there can fit into, but like you're saying, half of them in the zoning are split into residential and above. So that's how we went through the zoning to be specific and said, yeah, we don't want a whole bunch of commercial going up in Main Street.
So can we delineate that when we get to zoning?
Yeah, absolutely. That's kind of where I was going. It's like I understand exactly what you're saying, and so did the city before. Because they said we don't really want to push a bunch of commercial up towards Main Street. We want that to be the residential, which is that's residential in that area. It's a corridor. So.
Great. Thanks for answering that.
Okay.
Yeah, I think there's going to be a number of mixed use zoning categories. I mean, there are areas where mixed use means commercial next to residences. But there's also areas where we want it to be commercial and residential. We don't want to see exclusively residential development in that area. I mean, so it's going to have to be specified.
So one thing to consider could be that could be one of those other types of mixed uses, like you just said. Like we've proposed a change to the name of the harbor mixed use, so maybe it would make more sense if it wasn't the same as the overall mixed use. But again, whether that happens in the zoning or the general plan is what we're trying to figure out.
Amy, I'm all in favor of getting rid of all the overlays because they're like super confusing and super ambiguous. Okay, in the past, for example, the plan development overlay has been employed sometimes as a just kind of free-for-all, anything goes. It's plan development, we can do whatever we want. But today, however, currently it's really being employed more as what it says it's intended for, which is a place where there is an elevated standard of review. So if we're eliminating that, there are places in town where I think it is important for the city to be able to look at a project and say, this just doesn't work with Morro Bay. This is not the style of the city. This is inconsistent with, our guidelines, our design guidelines. How is that going to be accomplished?
Well, we're proposing that it would happen in the PD overlay in the zoning. So that right now there's that occurs in the zoning and the general plan. So it would be an overlay that would be applied through the zoning to certain properties, and the same type of process would occur.
Okay, so in other words, the PD overlay would be retained in the zoning ordinance, just
Correct.
not in the land use element.
It's odd to have it in both. You usually don't see that.
So just a couple of uses that I was curious about. You do have something in here about hospitals, but what about doctors' offices? We do have a lot of, sort of medical, dentists, doctors, whatever. Wondered where those fit in. Wondered where theaters fit in. And then also, and that may fit, well, it's not really, if we go down that road, marijuana facilities, what are the designations for those?
Well, for everything but the marijuana, this description is for the general plan, so we definitely can tailor it somewhat to be a little bit less or more specific or add certain things, but the zoning is where you're going to see the listing of uses that are or are not allowed. So this is to give kind of the characterization. And then I understand that the marijuana regulations are being updated currently by the city, so that will be very specifically laid out sometime soon.
It's on a parallel track.
And then how about theaters? Is that also,
for all of the other uses you mentioned,
visitor service,
we would
okay.
figure out where they would go in the zoning. But if you have specific comments about like parts of town that you haven't already given for the zoning, we can add that in.
And you already referred to professional and medical offices in the community commercial, it looks like, right? In that description, yeah. Okay. The one that somebody got overzealous with the strikeout on school. School just is gone, and it still is a designation, so tiny point.
Good to know.
Yeah.
So we're getting pretty much out of time here, so let me go through what we have, and then if we have any final questions, then we can do our wrap up. So open space recreation, this one is existing, and there's no FAR for this one. Environmentally sensitive habitat, we are updating that layer, as we mentioned earlier, so that will be applied to your general plan map as well. I think we have it as a base designation right now. As we finish that process of updating the layer, we might consider whether that makes the most sense. So that's late-breaking discussion between us.
So you mean like it could be an
overlay still.
Yeah.
It is an overlay now.
Yeah.
It is an overlay now. It could remain an overlay or become a base designation.
Right.
The real impact is how much of it is there and what does it encompass.
Right.
And that's really the decision that's in front of us as we evaluate that.
Yeah. Seems like that ought to remain an overlay just because that's going to change.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to change with climate. It's going to change when these sea level changes happen. It's going to change if the creek changes its path at some point again. So I think you'd always want to be able to move that as you discover things.
Mm-hmm. That's a good point.
The area right across from here, I can see you've got the residential sort of along the bluff there where it looks like the newer houses are going in. But across from that, you've got like that auto repair place and you got some, what looks like, what I think is residential, but it looks like you've got it down as community commercial. So I just was curious about that. It's kind of an odd little area. Some of it has storage units down below, and I've never understood why seems to be required. But I think a lot of that is residential, and it sort of looks more like community commercial.
It's definitely a mix in there, and yeah, there's been a lot of thought about this area as well, and we're definitely happy to consider that.
Okay.
That comment. Okay, so finally, I think this is the last slide. We have agriculture as one of your other designations, which we don't focus on too much in the heart of the city, but it does exist and will continue to exist. Public and slash institutional is what we're proposing to change from an overlay to a base designation, and as you can see, it's been applied in places like existing utilities, right here on the Veterans Building, and several other places. So that would be what we were proposing rather than having a variety of different things like school. And I noticed that our colors are a little bit off between the high school and some other spots, so we'll fix that. So that is it for all of the categories. If there are any other thoughts, we would love to hear them. Just to run quickly through what we're doing next, Jeff pretty much covered it already, but we're continuing on with drafting the plan and the zoning. We will have a meeting with you on August 17th, and we have another one scheduled on August 29th, which just became scheduled recently. And thank you. This is a lot to get through tonight. We really appreciate your attention and your good questions.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone. That was a yeoman's job. So we now move on to closing comments from committee members.
I don't have anything.
Looks like we've pretty much said our piece. So we'll move on to closing comments from the Development Director and Community Development Director, and from Michael Baker.
I want to follow up on Amy's comment on we're going to have 2 meetings in August, one on the 29th from 4 to 6 in here. I'm sorry, at the multi-use room in the community center. Apologize for that.
Both of them, or just the 29th?
Just the 29th. And there's only 5 of you going to be here. That's a quorum. So if that changes, that's Jan, Rich, Glenn, Chair Teft.
What day of the week is that?
And Susan Schneider. Yeah.
Is that that's a Thursday also? No, it's a Tuesday. Oh, Tuesday, yeah, that's fine. Okay.
So if anything changes between now and then, please let us know. If one of you can't make it, then we'll be changing that meeting or canceling it because we wouldn't have a quorum. So
the 17th here and the
17th here and the 29th at the community center.
Very good.
That was all I had.
And nothing from us.
Okay. In that case, we will adjourn to our next scheduled meeting, which will be August 17th here at the Veterans Hall at 4 p.m. Thank you very much.